The sky was alive, not with stars, but with rage. The wind howled through the endless plains, carrying whispers that no human should have been able to hear. It wasn't the kind of storm that came and went, it was the kind that seemed to pulse with its own heart, its own anger. Lightning forked across the heavens, illuminating jagged mountains and trembling trees. Each bolt cracked like the wrath of an ancient god, shaking the earth and forcing even the boldest creatures of the forest to cower in their dens. The shaman stood alone against the wind. His cloak, stitched together from worn hides, snapped and twisted around him as though trying to break free. The wooden staff in his hand trembled, though whether from the storm or the shaman's own trembling hands, no one could say. His eyes, sharp and shadowed by years of searching for truths no one dared seek, gazed upward into the churning sky. He had heard the warnings since he was a boy. Stories told in hushed voices by elders who refused to look at the mountains when they spoke of it. The Thunderbird was not a tale to inspire courage, it was a warning, a promise of power so vast and untamed it could destroy as easily as it could protect. No one dared to say the name aloud during the rains, for fear it might hear. And yet, there he stood, calling out into the storm with a voice cracked by years and desperation. Great Spirit of the skies. His voice was swallowed almost immediately by the roar of thunder. He struck the ground with his staff, the sound like brittle bone against the unyielding earth. I am not afraid of your storms. If you can hear me, show yourself. The storm answered. The air grew thick and electric, humming with a force that felt alive. Each hair on the shaman's body stood upright, his skin prickling with the sensation of being watched. Then came the light, not a gentle glow, but a blinding, unrelenting burst of energy that shattered the darkness. For a moment, the entire world was illuminated, and in that light, something enormous moved. He fell to his knees, not out of reverence, but because the weight of its presence pressed down on his chest. He could barely breathe, his ribs feeling as though they might collapse under the invisible force. Above him, a shape took form in the storm clouds. Wings, impossibly wide and feathered with light, stretched across the sky. Each feather seemed to spark with its own lightning, illuminating swirling clouds and casting monstrous shadows across the ground. The head of the Thunderbird was crowned with jagged horns that flickered with a fire that wasn't fire. The shaman clenched his staff tighter, grounding himself as best as he could in the face of such a creature. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, burned like twin suns staring straight into his soul. He felt small, insignificant, and painfully mortal beneath that gaze. It didn't speak. Words would have been too human for something like it. Instead, the Thunderbird's presence filled the air with an unspoken question. Why have you disturbed me? I come for answers, he shouted into the tempest, his voice breaking. The world below is dying. The waters are drying, the trees are withering. You hold the storms, the rains, the skies. We need your help. The wind screamed louder, as though mocking his plea. Lightning lashed the earth, striking a tree mere feet from where he knelt. The ancient oak exploded into shards, its fiery remnants cast out into the darkness. The shaman didn't flinch. His fear was vast, but his desperation was greater. For a moment, everything went still. The wind stopped its howling, and the thunder rolled far into the distance, as if retreating. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Then, the Thunderbird moved closer, its immense wings stirring the clouds. With every beat, the world trembled. The shaman's mind flooded with visions, images so vivid and overwhelming they almost knocked him unconscious. He saw rivers turning to dust, fields of golden crops blackened and barren. He saw fire tearing through forests, the cries of animals fading into silence. Then he saw the mountains split open by lightning, revealing something ancient, something dark that should have never been disturbed. The Thunderbird's warning was clear. The storm was not just a response to human greed or imbalance. Something worse was waking, something the Thunderbird itself had once fought to bury. But then came another vision. A boy with a heart of fire. A woman standing atop a mountain, her hands raised to the heavens. A feather, larger than any man, falling gently into the hands of someone the shaman could not yet see. The Thunderbird's eyes burned brighter, and the shaman understood. He was not the one who could fix this. He was the messenger. The light surrounding the Thunderbird began to dim, and its massive form started to retreat into the clouds. "Wait," the shaman cried, stumbling to his feet. "I don't know what to do. What should I tell them?" The creature paused, just long enough for him to hear one final clap of thunder. In its roar, he thought he heard a single word. "Balance." Then it was gone. The sky above him stilled, as if nothing had ever been there at all. The clouds broke apart, revealing a sea of stars that blinked innocently against the night. The ground beneath him was scorched, the air still tingling with the electric charge of something far beyond mortal comprehension. The shaman stood in silence, his staff barely keeping him upright. His breath came in shallow gasps, his mind reeling from what he had just witnessed. He had called out to the storm, and it had answered. Not with comfort or promises, but with power and fury. Somewhere in the distance, wolves began to howl, their cries echoing against the mountains. The shaman turned toward them, his grip on the staff steadying. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he had seen enough to understand one thing. The Thunderbird was awake. The crackle of the fire was the only sound in the room. Smoke curled upward, weaving through the dim light of the single lantern that flickered against the cold stone walls. Aiden sat cross-legged on the worn rug, his fingers tracing the faint carvings on the leather-bound tome before him. The book smelled of earth and time, its pages crumbling at the edges like the fragile memories of the old woman across from him. Her voice, cracked and wavering like the firelight, broke the silence. "You want to know about the Thunderbird?" she asked, her gnarled hands gripping the edge of her shawl. Her eyes, cloudy with age, seemed to see something far beyond the room, beyond the moment. Aiden nodded, his breath caught in his chest. He had waited weeks for this moment, after endless whispers in the marketplace and trails of half-forgotten rumors. This was the last elder of her kind, a keeper of stories no one dared to remember. She let out a slow, heavy sigh, as if the weight of the story threatened to pull her into the past. "The Thunderbird is not just a story," she said, her voice low, almost trembling. "It's a warning. A reminder. And sometimes, it is a promise." The room seemed to shrink, the shadows pressing closer as her words hung in the air. Aiden leaned forward, unable to stop himself. What happened? What did it do? Her lips pressed together, and for a long moment, she didn't speak. Then, slowly, she reached for the fire. With hands steady despite their frailty, she tossed a handful of dried herbs into the flames. The fire roared to life, the air thick with the sharp scent of cedar and sage. "It begins with the skies," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "When the skies darken, and the wind scream like a mourning mother. That's when you know it has woken." Aiden's heart pounded as the flames reflected in her eyes, making her look as if she, too, burned with the fire. But why? Why would it wake? He pressed, the words tumbling out of him before he could stop them. The elder turned her gaze to him, her expression both sharp and sad. "Why does anything wake, boy?" "Because it must." She fell silent after that, and no matter how much he begged or pleaded, she would say no more. Underscore 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 underscore. The sun was low in the sky when Aiden left the elder's home, his mind spinning with questions that had no answers. The world seemed to move slower as he walked through the village, his feet kicking up dust that glowed golden in the fading light. He had thought he'd find clarity, a story with a beginning, middle, and end. Instead, he was left with fragments, like the broken shards of a pottery vase that once held water but now only held emptiness. He made his way to the library, a sanctuary of old wood and crumbling paper, where the scent of ink and dust seemed to settle into his very skin. The librarian, a thin man with spectacles perched precariously on his nose, barely looked up as Aiden passed. He knew why the boy had come, everyone did. The Thunderbird's shadow loomed over their stories, their songs, their silences. In the farthest corner of the library, Aiden found it. An old chest, its hinges rusted, its lid warped from years of neglect. He pried it open with a creak that echoed through the stillness, revealing scrolls and books that seemed to shiver at the touch of light. He read until the lantern burned low, his fingers stained with ink and his eyes aching from the strain. Each story was different, yet they all carried the same thread of warning. Some spoke of the Thunderbird as a protector, calling rains to quench parched lands and lightning to strike down those who threatened the balance. Others painted it as a harbinger of destruction, its storms drowning villages and tearing apart forests. One account stood out, its words scrawled in a shaky hand on a piece of brittle parchment. It came to us in the night. The winds tore the roofs from our homes, and the rain flooded the fields. We ran to the temple, praying for mercy. But the Thunderbird does not grant mercy. It grants truth. And the truth was this: we had taken too much, and now we had to pay. The sky burned with its wings, and when the dawn came, nothing was left but ash. Aiden felt a chill run down his spine. The words seemed to echo in his mind, louder than the storm they described. But there were other stories, softer ones. Stories of how the Thunderbird had guided lost travelers home, its wings lighting the way through the darkness. Stories of how it had blessed harvests, its presence in the clouds a sign of abundance. These contradictions gnawed at him. How could something be both savior and destroyer? How could it be feared and revered in the same breath? Underscore 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 underscore. Aiden returned to the elder the next day, clutching a page torn from one of the books. He laid it before her, his hands shaking. "What is it?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Why is it so many things?" She stared at the page for a long time, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before. "Because the Thunderbird is not a thing to be understood, boy. It is not good or evil, right or wrong. It simply is. But how can we know what it wants?" Aiden asked, his frustration bubbling over. Her eyes met his, steady and piercing. "We can't. We can only listen. And hope." Her words did nothing to quiet the storm in his mind. As he left her home, he looked to the mountains in the distance, their peaks shrouded in mist. For the first time, he noticed how the clouds gathered there, swirling like they were waiting for something. Something stirred in his chest, a mixture of fear, awe, and something he couldn't quite name. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, the wind pushing against his back, daring him to leap. The Thunderbird was out there, waiting. And the stories were only the beginning. The wind near Thunderbird Mountain always carried a strange sound, a low, mournful whistle that seeped into the bones of those who dared approach. It wasn't the wind that howled, people said, it was the mountain itself, warning intruders to turn back. Thick clouds clung to its jagged peaks, swirling endlessly as if caught in the grip of an invisible hand. From the valley below, the mountain loomed like a sleeping giant, its ridges sharp and cruel. Few dared to climb it, and those who did often returned changed. If they returned at all. The stories were whispered everywhere, told by mothers to children as they warned them not to stray too far, and murmured by the old men in the market when the skies began to darken. They said the storms that brewed on the mountain weren't like the ones that rolled through the valley. They didn't come and go with the seasons. These storms lingered, heavy with lightning and a fury that felt alive. One boy had claimed he'd seen it once, a flash of wings, impossibly large, cutting through the storm clouds. He'd been laughed at by the braver boys in the village, but the elders hadn't laughed. They'd fallen silent, their faces growing pale as they stared up at the distant peak. The truth was that Thunderbird Mountain wasn't just a place. It was a presence. Aiden had felt it the first time he stood at its base, the ancient path winding upward like a serpent. The air was thicker here, humming faintly as though the very ground vibrated with unseen power. His every step felt heavy, not from the weight of the climb, but from something he couldn't name. The villagers had begged him not to go. "It's cursed," they'd said, their voices frantic. "The storms will take you. Or worse, the Thunderbird will." But Aiden's curiosity burned brighter than their warnings. As he ascended, the trees began to thin, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. The air grew colder, sharper, cutting through his clothes like icy blades. The higher he climbed, the louder the sound became, a low, thrumming growl that seemed to echo from deep within the mountain itself. He paused to catch his breath, leaning against a boulder slick with moss. His heart raced, but it wasn't just from the exertion. The mountain was alive around him, its presence pressing against his mind. Lightning crackled above, so close it felt like it might split the sky in two. He flinched as the thunder followed, a deafening roar that seemed to shake the earth beneath his feet. The storm was sudden, as if it had been waiting for him to reach this point. He could barely see now, the rain driving down in sheets, stinging his skin and soaking him to the bone. But he couldn't stop. Something pulled him forward, an invisible thread drawing him higher, closer to whatever lay at the mountain's heart. The trail narrowed, the edges crumbling away into nothingness. One misstep, and he would fall into the void below. But even as fear clawed at him, he pressed on, his breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. Then he saw it, a plateau carved into the mountain's face, its surface littered with ancient stones and markings. The symbols glowed faintly in the stormlight, their edges worn but unmistakable. He knelt to touch one, his fingers trembling against the cold stone. As he did, the growl of the mountain grew louder, vibrating through his chest. The air around him seemed to shift, heavy and electric, and he knew, without a doubt, that he was being watched. He looked up, and for a moment, the storm parted. Above him, framed by the clouds, he saw it. Wings spread wide, each feather crackling with lightning. Its eyes burned like molten gold, staring down at him with an intensity that froze him in place. Its beak, sharp and curved like the edge of a blade, glinted as another flash of lightning illuminated the sky. The Thunderbird was real. It didn't swoop down or strike him with its talons. It didn't need to. Its presence alone was enough to make him feel as though the ground might give way beneath him. He could barely breathe, the air thick with the weight of its gaze. Then it let out a cry, a sound so piercing it felt as though it might split his skull. The storm roared in answer, and the plateau seemed to tremble beneath him. Aiden fell to his knees, clutching his chest as the sound reverberated through his very bones. He didn't know how long he stayed there, hunched and trembling. When he finally looked up again, the Thunderbird was gone. The storm had begun to ease, the rain softening to a gentle mist. But the markings on the stones glowed brighter now, their shapes shifting as if alive. He reached out again, his fingers tracing one that looked like a feather. Heat pulsed beneath his touch, and for a brief moment, he saw something. Flashes of fire and wind. A great battle waged in the skies. Mountains crumbling under the force of a storm. And the Thunderbird, its wings spread wide, shielding something or someone. When the vision faded, he found himself lying on the ground, the stones cold against his skin. He sat up slowly, his head pounding and his heart racing. The mountain was silent now, its presence less menacing but no less powerful. Aiden knew he couldn't stay. As he made his way back down the trail, the clouds began to close in again, their edges swirling with a strange, otherworldly light. The villagers were right to fear the mountain. It was cursed, in a way. But it was more than that. It was a guardian, a monument, a memory. And its storms were not random, they were warnings. It started with the skies. A bright, cloudless morning turned strange when a crack of thunder split the air without warning. The sun still shone, its light golden and soft over the fields, but the sound echoed through the valley like a warning shot. Villagers paused in their chores, their tools hanging mid-air, their gazes lifting to the heavens. By midday, the wind arrived. It wasn't the soft breeze they knew, carrying the scents of wildflowers and freshly tilled earth. This wind was sharp, biting. It howled through the trees, shaking branches until they groaned and splintered. Children clung to their mothers, their small hands clutching at skirts as the air grew colder, heavier. At dusk, the first storm came. It swept in from the direction of Thunderbird Mountain, rolling dark clouds that churned and twisted like a living thing. Lightning lit up the sky in jagged streaks, the flashes so bright they left the villagers blinking, their hearts pounding in unison with the thunder. Rain didn't fall at first, the storm seemed to hold it back, teasing the land with its fury. Then came the whirlwinds. In the middle of the fields, spinning towers of wind rose from the ground. They moved with purpose, tearing through the crops and leaving only chaos in their wake. One farmer, old Lorian, had tried to run to his barn when the first whirlwind appeared. He'd shouted something no one could hear over the roar of the storm, his face pale as he stumbled forward. But before he could reach shelter, the whirlwind took him. It wasn't until the next morning that they found him. He was unharmed, sitting in the middle of his ruined field, muttering about wings made of fire. By the third day, the villagers were whispering the same name, Thunderbird. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices trembling with fear. "It's angry," one woman said, her hands wringing a cloth so tightly it tore. "We've done something to anger it." No one disagreed. The signs grew stranger as the days passed. Livestock refused to eat, their eyes wide with fear as they bolted at the slightest sound. Dogs barked at nothing, their hackles raised as they stared at the empty sky. Birds, normally so noisy in the mornings, had vanished entirely. And then there was the lightning. It wasn't like ordinary lightning. This was something different, something alive. The strikes didn't hit at random, they seemed to aim. A tree in the middle of the forest, its bark blackened and smoldering. A scarecrow in the field, its straw reduced to ash. The church bell, split cleanly in two by a single, silent bolt. The villagers began to pray, their voices shaking as they gathered in the square. "We have to do something," the mayor said, his face drawn and gray. "If we don't, it will destroy us all." But what could they do? The Thunderbird was not a man, not a beast. It was something beyond them, something older than their prayers and their fears. Late one night, as the storms raged on, Aiden stood at the edge of the village. The wind tore at his cloak, the rain soaking him to the skin, but he didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, on the faint glow that seemed to pulse from Thunderbird Mountain. He thought about the stories he'd read, the warnings whispered by the elders. The Thunderbird didn't strike without reason. It punished, yes, but it also protected. It balanced. And balance, he realized, had been broken. A flash of lightning split the sky, illuminating the valley in stark, white light. For a brief moment, he thought he saw something, a shadow in the clouds, massive wings spreading wide. But the vision was gone as quickly as it came, leaving him breathless, his heart hammering in his chest. In the village below, the lights in the windows flickered and went out, one by one, until the darkness was complete. The fire had nearly died in the hearth, its last embers glowing faintly in the darkness. Outside, the storm continued to rage, its relentless wind clawing at the walls of the small house. Aiden sat hunched by the dying flames, his fingers gripping the edge of a woolen blanket, his mind unable to find rest. Sleep was a distant thing, teasing and elusive, but exhaustion finally pulled him under. The moment his eyes closed, the world shifted. It was no ordinary dream. The air was thick and electric, humming with an unseen force. He stood in an endless expanse of darkness, the ground beneath him smooth and cold, though he couldn't see it. The wind swirled around him, hot and cold all at once, carrying with it a sound like distant whispers. No, not whispers. Wings. His chest tightened, every nerve alive with an unfamiliar tension. Then the sky split apart. Blinding light poured down, so fierce he had to shield his eyes with his arm. But even through the burning glare, he could see it. A figure in the sky, vast and unrelenting. It wasn't just a bird, it was a storm, alive and breathing. Its wings stretched wide, feathers made of streaking lightning that crackled and danced against the darkness. Every beat of its wings sent shockwaves through the air, the sound vibrating in his chest. Its eyes, burning with molten light, locked onto him, pinning him in place. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The sheer size of it was overwhelming, each feather larger than a house, its talons glowing like molten steel. It dove toward him, the force of its descent shaking the very fabric of the dream. Aiden braced for impact, his heart racing, his hands trembling. But it didn't strike. Instead, it hovered before him, its massive form towering over his small frame. Its presence was suffocating, yet he couldn't look away. The golden light of its eyes softened, shifting like a river's current. In his mind, a voice rose, not spoken, but felt, as if it came from the depths of his own soul. Balance must be restored. The words were both a command and a plea, heavy with meaning he didn't yet understand. The Thunderbird's gaze deepened, and in its depths, he saw visions, flashes of a world out of sync. Crops withering under strange skies. Storms tearing through peaceful lands. A mountain cracking open, spilling fire and chaos. And then, a final image burned itself into his mind, the mountain itself, its peak crowned with storm clouds, a glowing light at its summit. His knees buckled, and he collapsed to the ground. The Thunderbird let out a cry, a sound that wasn't just heard but felt, shaking the very core of his being. The light around him dimmed, the storm fading into silence. When he looked up again, the bird was gone, its presence replaced by the vast emptiness of the dream. But the feeling remained. It was in his chest, a weight that pressed down with relentless urgency. He reached out, his fingers clawing at the darkness, but there was nothing to hold onto. Then, with a jolt, he woke. His body was drenched in sweat, his breaths coming in sharp, ragged gasps. The fire in the hearth had gone out completely, leaving the room cold and shadowed. The storm outside had stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Aiden stood at the edge of the village square, his thoughts a tangled storm of urgency and uncertainty. The vision still burned in his mind, the massive bird, the crackling wings, the command that left no room for hesitation. Balance must be restored. He knew he couldn't face what lay ahead alone. The wind carried faint traces of smoke and distant voices as he approached the elder's hut, a modest structure tucked beneath the gnarled branches of an ancient tree. The door creaked open before he could knock, and Elder Sarah stood there, her piercing eyes studying him as if she had been expecting this moment. "You've seen it, haven't you?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Aiden nodded, unable to find the words. "Come inside," she said. The air in her hut was thick with the scent of herbs and old parchment. Shelves lined the walls, crammed with scrolls, dried flowers, and jars filled with powders of every imaginable color. Sarah moved with the slow grace of someone who carried the weight of countless years, her fingers brushing the edge of a worn table as she gestured for Aiden to sit. "The Thunderbird doesn't show itself to just anyone," she began, her tone heavy with meaning. "You've been chosen, though I doubt you understand why." "I don't," Aiden admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't ignore it. I have to do something." Sarah gave a faint smile, her wrinkled face softening. "Doing something is the first step. But you'll need more than willpower to face what's ahead." Her words hung in the air like a challenge, and Aiden felt their weight. The next morning, she sent him to find Kale. Kale was a warrior, a man known for his skill with a blade and his sharp tongue. He lived on the outskirts of the village, his hut perched near the forest's edge. Aiden had never spoken to him before, but he knew the stories. Kale had fought in battles far from the valley, returning with scars both visible and hidden. He wasn't the kind of man who would join a cause lightly. When Aiden arrived, Kale was splitting firewood, his movements swift and precise. He didn't stop as Aiden approached, his eyes flicking up only briefly. "What do you want?" Kale asked, his voice gruff. Aiden hesitated, his resolve faltering under the warrior's hard gaze. But then he thought of the vision, the fire, the mountain, the command that wouldn't let him rest. "I need your help," Aiden said finally. Kale paused, his axe resting against the wood. Help with what? Aiden took a deep breath, forcing the words out. The Thunderbird. The storms. I think it's calling me to fix what's wrong. Cale stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he snorted, shaking his head. You think you can fix a storm? You think the gods care what you do? It's not just me, Aiden said, his voice firmer now. Something's happening, and if we don't act, it's going to get worse. Cale leaned on his axe, his eyes narrowing. And what makes you think I'm the man for this? Because you've faced things most of us can't even imagine, Aiden said, meeting his gaze. Because you know what it means to fight, even when the odds are impossible. For a moment, Cale said nothing. Then he sighed, wiping his hands on his tunic. You're either the bravest fool I've ever met or the dumbest. Fine. I'll hear you out. But if this is some wild chase after a fairy tale, don't expect me to stick around. With Cale begrudgingly on board, the next step was finding the Wanderer. She appeared as if from nowhere, slipping into the village one afternoon with the quiet grace of a shadow. Her name was Isolde, and she was unlike anyone Aiden had ever met. Her dark cloak billowed in the wind, the hood pulled low over her face, but her piercing eyes caught every detail. She spoke little, but when she did, her words carried the weight of knowledge that stretched far beyond the valley. She seemed to know things no one else did, about the Thunderbird, the storms, and the strange signs that had plagued the land. Aiden approached her cautiously, unsure how to even begin. You're the one who saw it, she said before he could speak, her voice calm and even. His heart skipped a beat. How do you know that? Isolde's lips curved into a faint smile. The storms tell a story if you know how to listen. Aiden felt a chill run through him. There was something about her, something that made him trust her even as it unsettled him. Will you help us? He asked, his voice trembling slightly. Isolde tilted her head, studying him as if weighing his soul. The Thunderbird isn't just a story to me, she said. It's real, and it's dangerous. If you want my help, you'll have to be ready for what's coming. I am, Aiden said, though the words felt almost too big for his mouth. She nodded, her expression unreadable. Then we begin at dawn. The three of them, Aiden, Cale, and Isolde, gathered in the elder's hut as the night deepened, the storm outside swirling like an impatient spectator. Sarah sat by the hearth, her hands weaving patterns in the air as she spoke of ancient rites and forgotten truths. Cale leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, his face set in a skeptical scowl. Isolde stood near the window, her eyes fixed on the horizon, her fingers tracing invisible lines in the fogged glass. And Aiden sat in the center, the weight of their gazes heavy on his shoulders. Each of them was so different, their paths winding and tangled, yet here they were, drawn together by something larger than themselves. The storm outside howled, its fury a reminder of what lay ahead. But for the first time, Aiden didn't feel alone. The heavy oak door groaned as Cale pushed it open, its echo spiraling into the yawning darkness beyond. Dust danced in the dim beams of light that filtered through cracks in the stone walls, and the air was cold, heavy with the scent of decay and time. Isolde stepped forward, her footsteps impossibly soft on the ancient floor, while Sarah's whispered incantation sent a faint glow spilling from the small lantern she held aloft. The place was a ruin, forgotten by all but whispers, its grandeur reduced to crumbling stone and shattered tiles. Yet even in its disrepair, the remnants of intricate carvings and faded murals hinted at the significance it once held. Aiden felt a chill run down his spine as he followed the others, his breath visible in the cold air. They reached the center of the chamber, where a vast table of polished stone stood surrounded by towering shelves of scrolls. Many of the scrolls were brittle, their edges crumbling to dust at the slightest touch, but others remained intact, protected by layers of careful wrapping. This is it, Sarah said, her voice soft with reverence. The place of the ancients. Their knowledge has been waiting for us. Cale scowled, resting his hand on the hilt of his sword. Let's hope it has answers, not just more questions. Aiden stepped closer to the table, his eyes drawn to an intricate carving etched into its surface. It was the Thunderbird, its wings spread wide, lightning pouring from its feathers. The details were breathtaking, every feather, every line of its eyes burning with the same intensity that haunted his dreams. Isolde crouched beside a nearby shelf, her fingers brushing against the brittle parchment of a scroll. She unwrapped it carefully, her movements deliberate and slow. As the layers of protection fell away, the scroll revealed itself, its ink still vivid despite the weight of centuries. "It's a hymn," she said, her voice quiet but charged with meaning. "A hymn to the Thunderbird." She began to read aloud, the ancient words carrying a strange rhythm that made the air itself feel alive. Sarah leaned in, her eyes narrowing as she translated. "It speaks of balance," Sarah murmured. "Of storms as a reflection of the world's harmony, or its chaos. The Thunderbird does not cause the storms. It is the storm, an extension of the forces that bind all things." Aiden's chest tightened as the words sank in. He could almost hear the crackle of lightning, feel the weight of those burning eyes. "Here," Isolde said, pulling another scroll from the shelf. This one was different, its edges singed as if by fire. The script was dense, the letters curling like smoke, and it depicted a series of images, a mountain, a storm, and finally, a figure standing before the Thunderbird itself. "It's a warning," Isolde said, her tone sharper now. "The Thunderbird is not just a guardian. It awakens only in times of great imbalance, when the world teeters on the edge of destruction." Cale snorted, his skepticism plain. "And we're supposed to believe this?" "It's not about belief," Aiden said, his voice trembling with the weight of realization. "It's about understanding. The storms, the visions, they're not random. They're signs that something is wrong." Sarah nodded, her expression grave. "The Thunderbird doesn't come to punish. It comes to restore. But restoration is never without cost." Aiden's gaze fell to the carvings on the table, his fingers tracing the lines of the Thunderbird's wings. The vision of the mountain flashed in his mind again, the storm circling its peak, the blinding light. "Here," Isolde said suddenly, her voice pulling him back. She held up another scroll, its edges frayed but its ink still bold. "This one speaks of the mountain." Sarah's eyes widened as she read over Isolde's shoulder. "Thunderbird Mountain. It's not just a place. It's a crucible. The ancients believed it was the point where the mortal and the divine converged. A place of power." Cale frowned, his hand tightening on his sword hilt. "And what does that mean for us?" "It means," Isolde said, her voice steady, "that the mountain is where this must end. Where balance must be restored." The air in the chamber seemed to grow colder, the weight of their discovery pressing down on them like a physical force. Aiden swallowed hard, his mind racing. The Thunderbird wasn't just a creature of legend. It was a force, a protector that awakened only in the face of unimaginable danger. And now, it was awake. They spent hours poring over the scrolls, piecing together fragments of the Thunderbird's story. Each revelation brought more questions, more uncertainty, but also a growing sense of purpose. The Thunderbird was more than a storm, more than a legend. It was the voice of the earth itself, a reminder of the delicate balance that held the world together. As the lantern's glow began to fade, Eden looked around at the faces of his companions. Sarah's eyes were weary but determined, Cale's expression unreadable, and Isolde's gaze sharp with something he couldn't quite place. "We've found what we came for," Sarah said finally, her voice soft. "But this is only the beginning." Aiden nodded, his fingers curling into fists. The vision had brought him here, to this ancient place filled with the whispers of the past. Now, those whispers were calling him forward, toward the mountain, toward the storm, toward the Thunderbird. The air inside the ancient chambers seemed to thicken as Sarah's voice faltered, her words tapering off into a stunned silence. She held the scroll in trembling hands, its delicate edges curling slightly in the glow of the flickering lantern. Aiden, Cale, and Isolde leaned in, the tension between them taut as a bowstring. "What does it say?" Aiden asked, his voice barely audible. Sarah cleared her throat, her eyes scanning the densely packed symbols on the scroll. "It speaks of the Thunderbird's awakening," she said slowly. "Of a time when the world's harmony is shattered, and the storm takes form to restore it. Kale crossed his arms, his brow furrowed. We already know that. What else? Sarah hesitated, the faintest shadow of fear passing over her face. The prophecy is twofold, she said finally. The Thunderbird's power is neither good nor evil, it is pure force, untamed and immense. And it will tip the scales, depending on who wields it. The words fell like a thunderclap in the room, echoing against the stone walls. Aiden felt his chest tighten, a cold knot forming in his stomach. Who wields it? Kale repeated, his voice sharp. You're saying someone can control it? Not control, Sarah corrected, her voice a whisper. But influence. Guide. The Thunderbird answers the call of balance. It will bring salvation if the intentions are pure, or destruction if they are not. Aiden's mind reeled as he tried to process the enormity of what she was saying. He thought of the storms that had ravaged the valley, the crackling energy in his vision, the overwhelming sense of something vast and alive. And now this, the knowledge that the Thunderbird's power could reshape the world for better or worse. It's more than a creature, Isolde said, her voice steady but laced with an undertone of unease. She stepped closer to the table, her fingers brushing against the edge of the scroll. It's a force. A primal energy that amplifies what it touches. If it awakens into a world ruled by fear or greed. Her words trailed off, but the implication was clear. Kale snorted, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his unease. And how are we supposed to know who's worthy of guiding it? What if we make the wrong choice? Aiden looked at him, his heart pounding. What if it's not about choosing someone, he said. What if it's about all of us? About the world itself? Sarah nodded slowly, her gaze distant as if peering into some unseen horizon. The prophecy says the Thunderbird reflects the state of the world. If the world is broken, so is the storm. If there is harmony, she paused, her voice catching. Then there is hope. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them like a heavy fog. Aiden's thoughts raced. He had felt the Thunderbird's power in his vision, the raw, untamed force of it. He knew it wasn't something that could be bent to any single person's will. And yet, the idea that its awakening could be shaped by the hearts of those who called it was both terrifying and exhilarating. What else does the scroll say? Isolde asked, her voice cutting through the stillness. Sarah scanned the text again, her fingers trailing along the delicate script. It speaks of trials, she said. Tests of character, of resolve. The one who stands before the Thunderbird must face them all and emerge unbroken. Kale muttered under his breath, shaking his head. Tests of character, he said, his tone dripping with skepticism. And what happens if they fail? Sarah's face darkened. Then the storm will rage unchecked. And the world will burn. The words hung in the air like a blade poised to fall. Aiden felt a shiver run down his spine, the enormity of the task ahead pressing down on him like a physical weight. Isolde's expression was unreadable as she turned toward him. You've seen it, she said softly. The Thunderbird. Do you think you can stand before it? Aiden hesitated, the memory of his vision flashing in his mind, the blinding light, the deafening roar, the piercing gaze that seemed to see straight into his soul. I don't know, he admitted. But I don't think it's about just me. It's about all of us. Kale gave a bitter laugh, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Well, that's comforting, he said dryly. The fate of the world rests on us. A boy with dreams, an elder with riddles, a wanderer who speaks in half-truths, and me, a soldier who's seen too much to believe in anything. Aiden looked at him, his eyes steady. It's not about belief, he said quietly. It's about doing what's right. Even if it feels impossible. Kale stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. You're either braver than you look or just incredibly foolish, he said. Either way, I'm in. For now. Sarah placed the scroll carefully back on the table, her hands lingering for a moment as if reluctant to let it go. The prophecy doesn't promise an easy path, she said. But it does promise one thing: those who face the Thunderbird will be changed forever. Aiden swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. He thought of the storm raging beyond the mountain, the lives already lost, the ones that could still be saved. He didn't know if he was ready to face the Thunderbird or the trials that awaited him, but he knew one thing: they couldn't turn back now. The lantern flickered, casting long shadows across the room. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the distant rumble of thunder. Aiden closed his eyes, his heart pounding. Somewhere out there, the Thunderbird waited, its power poised to tip the scales of the world. And whether they were ready or not, the time to act was drawing near. The night sky stretched above them like a tapestry woven with a million glittering threads. Stars pulsed softly against the inky darkness, and the faint shimmer of constellations seemed alive, moving subtly as if whispering secrets too ancient for words. Aiden tilted his head back, his breath catching as he traced the jagged line of Orion's belt, then further to the strange cluster of stars Sarah had pointed out earlier, a formation that didn't belong to any map he'd ever seen. "They call it the Thunderbird's wing," Sarah said, her voice quiet, almost reverent. She stood a few paces ahead, her face bathed in silver light. "The elders say it only appears when the storms begin. It's a sign." Cale snorted softly, leaning against a weathered boulder. "A sign of what?" he muttered. "More trouble?" Aiden ignored him, his gaze locked on the constellation. There was something about it, something uncanny. The stars in the formation gleamed brighter than the others, their light almost pulsing, like the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. "It's not just a constellation," Isolde said from the shadows. Her voice carried a weight that drew all their attention. She stepped closer to the group, her dark cloak rustling like dry leaves. "It's a map." Sarah turned sharply. "A map?" Isolde nodded, her face illuminated faintly by the lantern's glow. "The elders I met on my travels spoke of the Thunderbird's wing. They said it shows the way to its resting place. But only if you can read the patterns." Cale straightened, a trace of curiosity breaking through his skepticism. "Patterns?" Isolde gestured toward the stars, her movements slow and deliberate. "The sky isn't just random. It's a code. The Thunderbird's wing aligns with certain celestial events, eclipses, comets, solstices. Each alignment reveals a piece of the path." Aiden felt a shiver crawl down his spine. He glanced back at the stars, his heart pounding. Was it possible? Could the heavens truly hold the answers they sought? Sarah's eyes gleamed with a mix of awe and determination. She pulled a faded parchment from her satchel, the corners frayed with age. "This is the Star Chronicle," she said, unfolding it carefully. The delicate ink lines depicted constellations, their shapes intricately drawn alongside notes scrawled in an ancient script. "This," she continued, pointing to a set of symbols near the Thunderbird's wing, "matches what we saw in the scroll. A prophecy tied to the heavens. If we're right, these symbols will lead us to the next piece of the puzzle." Cale squinted at the parchment, his brow furrowed. "Great. So now we're chasing stars. What's next? Talking to the moon?" Aiden shot him a sharp glance. "If you don't believe in this, why are you here?" Cale held his gaze for a moment, then looked away, his jaw tightening. "Because someone has to keep you from getting killed." The tension crackled between them, but Sarah stepped in, her voice firm. "Enough. We need to focus. The Star Chronicle is our guide now. We can't afford to lose time." They moved cautiously, their eyes scanning the heavens for clues. Aiden's heart raced as Sarah traced the parchment, comparing its lines to the stars above. With every step, he felt the weight of something immense pressing down on him, something both terrifying and awe-inspiring. As the hours passed, the sky seemed to shift, the stars rearranging themselves into strange, fleeting shapes. A comet streaked across the heavens, its tail a brilliant cascade of light that left a faint trail in its wake. "There!" Sarah exclaimed, pointing. "The wing aligns with the comet. That's our marker." Cale raised an eyebrow. "And what are we supposed to do with that? Wish on it?" Isolde ignored him, stepping forward with a calm authority. The comet's tail points east, she said. Toward the mountains. Aiden's stomach churned. The mountains loomed in the distance, their jagged peaks silhouetted against the faint glow of the horizon. Thunder rumbled faintly, a low, ominous growl that seemed to echo from deep within the earth. That's where we're headed, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Cale shook his head, muttering something under his breath, but he didn't argue. The group pressed on, their path lit only by the stars and the dim lantern's glow. The terrain grew rougher, the ground uneven and treacherous. Shadows stretched long and dark around them, and the wind carried with it a sharp, electric chill. Aiden couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every flicker of movement at the edge of his vision set his nerves on edge. He clutched his staff tightly, his knuckles white. As they climbed higher into the hills, the stars above seemed to grow brighter, their light cutting through the darkness like shards of glass. Sarah paused suddenly, her gaze fixed on the ground. "What is it?" Aiden asked, his voice low. She knelt, brushing away a layer of dirt to reveal a carved symbol etched into the rock, a spiraling pattern that mirrored the Thunderbird's wing. "This is it," she whispered. "The next marker." Cale crouched beside her, his skepticism momentarily replaced by curiosity. "Looks old. Really old." "It's more than old," Sarah said. "It's a sign that we're on the right path." Isolde studied the carving, her expression unreadable. "The stars brought us here. But this is just the beginning. The real test lies ahead." Aiden swallowed hard, his heart thundering in his chest. The wind howled around them, and the distant rumble of thunder grew louder, closer. For a moment, he looked up at the stars, their cold, unblinking light a reminder of the vastness of the task before them. The prophecy, the patterns, the storm, it all felt impossibly large, as if they were mere specks in a story far greater than themselves. But then he thought of the village below, the people living in fear of the storms, the children who cried in the night, their small hands clutching at the safety of their blankets. He thought of the Thunderbird's power, waiting to be awakened, waiting to tip the scales. And he knew they couldn't stop now. The forest seemed alive in a way that defied explanation. Branches whispered secrets to the wind, and the air was thick with a strange, electric tension. Aiden felt his pulse quicken as the group stepped cautiously into the clearing, their boots crunching softly against the damp earth. It wasn't just the eerie silence that unnerved him, it was the sense of being watched. The first sign came as a low hum, like the sound of distant bees. Sarah paused, her head tilting as she tried to locate its source. The hum grew louder, sharper, turning into a high-pitched whistle that sent shivers racing down Aiden's spine. He turned toward the sound, and his breath caught in his throat. From the shadows emerged a fox, its fur shimmering like liquid silver, its eyes glowing a vivid, unnatural blue. It moved with a grace that was almost hypnotic, its paws gliding over the ground without a sound. "That's no ordinary fox," Cale muttered, his hand tightening around the hilt of his sword. Isolde raised a hand to stop him. "Wait," she said, her voice calm but firm. "It's not here to harm us. Not yet." The fox stopped a few feet away, its gaze fixed on Aiden. The glow in its eyes pulsed in rhythm with the humming sound, which now seemed to come from the creature itself. Aiden felt as though the air around him had thickened, making it harder to breathe. Without warning, the fox leapt forward, its movements too fast to follow. Aiden flinched, raising his arms to shield himself, but the impact never came. Instead, the fox circled him, its tail leaving faint streaks of light in the air. "It's testing you," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Stand your ground." Aiden's heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay still. The fox stopped abruptly, its nose inches from his hand. It sniffed once, then tilted its head as if studying him. Slowly, it raised a paw and pressed it against his chest. A surge of energy shot through Aiden, leaving him gasping. He saw flashes, images of storms raging over mountains, rivers overflowing their banks, and fields drenched in rain. But amidst the chaos, there was balance, a harmony that tied it all together. When the fox stepped back, its glow had dimmed. It turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving the group in stunned silence. That was rain, Isolde said softly. One of the Thunderbird's elements. Before anyone could respond, the wind picked up, swirling leaves and dirt into the air. The hum returned, but this time it was accompanied by a low, mournful howl. From the treetops descended an owl, its feathers a swirling pattern of white and gray, as though they had been painted by the wind itself. The owl's wings stretched wide, and with each beat, gusts of wind whipped through the clearing, forcing the group to shield their faces. "This one's mine," Cale said, stepping forward despite Sarah's protests. His usual bravado was tempered by a rare seriousness as he faced the owl. The bird landed in front of him, its piercing eyes locking onto his. The wind grew fiercer, pushing against Cale like an invisible wall. He planted his feet firmly, his muscles straining as he fought to remain standing. "You want me to prove myself?" Cale shouted over the roaring wind. "Fine." With a roar of his own, he took a step forward, then another, until he was face to face with the owl. The creature cocked its head, as if amused, before lifting into the air. It circled above him once, then dove, its talons grazing his shoulder lightly before it soared away. As the wind died down, Cale turned back to the group, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Guess I passed." Sarah shook her head but didn't say anything. The ground beneath them trembled, and the humming transformed into a deep, resonant rumble. From the earth itself rose a bear, its massive form composed of dark stone and cracks filled with glowing orange light. The heat it radiated was almost unbearable, and Aiden felt sweat bead on his forehead as it lumbered toward them. Sarah stepped forward before anyone could stop her. She knelt, pressing her palms to the ground as if she could feel the creature's heartbeat through the earth. "It's thunder," she said, her voice steady but tinged with awe. The bear growled low, the sound reverberating through their chests. It reared up on its hind legs, towering over her, its eyes burning like embers. Sarah didn't flinch. "We're here for balance," she said firmly, her voice carrying a strange authority. "We mean no harm." The bear paused, its massive head tilting as it regarded her. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, it lowered itself back to all fours and pressed its snout against her forehead. A faint glow passed between them, and the bear crumbled into dust, its essence dissipating into the air. Isolde stepped forward, her eyes scanning the clearing. "3 elements," she said. "Rain, wind, thunder. Each of them a piece of the Thunderbird's power. Each of them a test of our resolve." Aiden's legs felt weak beneath him, but he managed to stand tall. He looked around at his companions, each of them bearing marks of their trials, Cale's torn sleeve, Sarah's glowing forehead, and his own chest still tingling from the fox's touch. The forest was silent again, but the air was charged with a sense of purpose. Aiden knew this was only the beginning. They had passed the tests of the guardian spirits, but the Thunderbird's true power, and its true challenge, still awaited. The river flowed silently under the pale light of the moon, its waters black as ink but shimmering with a strange, ethereal glow. It seemed to carry whispers within its current, faint and fragmented, as though the very essence of the past lingered in its depths. The group stood at its edge, their shadows merging with the dark waters. Aiden's chest tightened as he gazed at the river, its presence unnerving yet strangely inviting, like a half-forgotten dream that begged to be remembered. "He's here," Isolde said softly, her voice cutting through the stillness. From the shadows of the trees emerged a figure, stooped but steady, his movements deliberate as though every step was a ritual. His face was lined with age, his eyes clouded but not empty. They held the weight of years and the burden of something else, knowledge. He carried a staff adorned with feathers and beads, which swayed gently as he walked, though there was no breeze. "You seek the Thunderbird," the old shaman said, his voice low and resonant. It wasn't a question. Aiden stepped forward, his throat dry. We were told you've seen it." The shaman's gaze settled on him, piercing through the boy's uncertainty. "Seen it?" He chuckled, the sound brittle as dried leaves. "I have felt its wings carve through the skies. I have heard its cry split the heavens." "Seen it?" He shook his head slowly. To see the Thunderbird is to witness the soul of the storm itself. The shaman gestured for them to sit by the riverbank, and the group obeyed, though unease lingered in the air. The old man lowered himself onto a flat stone, his staff resting across his lap. For a moment, he said nothing, his fingers brushing the surface of the water. "This river," he began, "is no ordinary stream. It holds memories of the land, of the people, of the Thunderbird." He dipped his hand into the water and drew out a small, shimmering orb of liquid that floated above his palm. "Do you wish to see what I have seen?" Kale tensed, his hand hovering near his sword. "What does that mean?" "It means your hearts must be steady," the shaman replied, his tone sharp as a blade. "The river does not lie. It will show you the truth, whether you are ready for it or not." Sarah nodded, her voice steady. "We are ready." The shaman's lips curved into a faint smile, though it did not reach his eyes. "So be it." He released the orb into the air, where it hung for a moment before bursting into a fine mist that enveloped the group. The world around them shifted. The riverbank dissolved, replaced by a vast, open plain under a sky roiling with dark clouds. Lightning crackled across the heavens, illuminating the massive shape that loomed above, a bird of impossible size, its wings spanning the horizon, its feathers shimmering like molten gold. The Thunderbird. Its cry tore through the air, a sound so powerful it seemed to shake the earth itself. The group instinctively shielded their ears, though the sound reverberated through their very bones. But the vision didn't end there. From the edges of the plain emerged shadows, figures cloaked in darkness, their forms shifting and amorphous. They moved as one, a wave of malevolence surging toward the Thunderbird. The great bird responded with a fury that seemed to embody the storm itself. Its wings beat against the sky, creating winds that tore at the shadows. Lightning arced from its talons, striking the ground with explosive force. The two forces clashed in a battle that defied comprehension, the sky and earth trembling under their fury. And yet, despite its power, the Thunderbird faltered. The shadows were relentless, their darkness seeping into the air like poison, their tendrils reaching toward the bird with an unnatural hunger. The vision shifted again, faster now, flashes of scenes that blurred together, villages consumed by storms, rivers bursting their banks, mountains splitting asunder. And then, silence. The Thunderbird stood alone, its form battered and dimmed, its cry no longer a roar but a mournful wail. The vision faded, leaving the group back on the riverbank, the mist dissipating into the night. The shaman's face was grim as he regarded them. "What you saw was the great conflict of ages past. The Thunderbird fought to protect the balance of this world, but even it could not stand against the shadows alone." "What are the shadows?" Aiden asked, his voice trembling. "They are the hunger that never ends," the shaman replied. "The greed, the hatred, the corruption that festers in the hearts of men and spreads like a plague. They are born of this world, yet they seek to consume it." Kale frowned. "If the Thunderbird is so powerful, why couldn't it destroy them?" "Because it is not its purpose," the shaman said. "The Thunderbird is a guardian, not a conqueror. Its power is tied to the balance of all things. To destroy the shadows outright would mean unraveling the threads that hold this world together." Sarah's voice was quiet but firm. "Then why did the shadows rise in the first place?" The shaman sighed, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the question. "Because balance is a fragile thing. It takes only a single act, a betrayal, a war, a moment of unchecked ambition, to tip the scales. And once they are tipped," he trailed off, his gaze distant. "What happened to the Thunderbird after the conflict?" Isolde asked. The shaman's expression hardened. "It withdrew. Wounded, weary, it retreated to the sacred peak, where it waits. For what, I cannot say. Perhaps for the world to right itself. Perhaps for those who would prove themselves worthy of its power." Aiden looked at the river, its surface calm but deceptively deep. "And what about us? What are we supposed to do?" The shaman met his gaze, his eyes heavy with meaning. "That is for you to decide. But know this, the Thunderbird will not act without purpose. If it has stirred, it is because the shadows are rising again. And this time, he paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. This time, the choice of salvation or destruction may lie in the hands of those who seek it. The weight of his words settled over the group, unspoken questions hanging in the air. The river continued its quiet song, carrying memories into the night, as if waiting for the next chapter to be written. The ground trembled beneath their feet, a low, grumbling growl that seemed to rise from the earth's very core. Aiden stopped mid-step, his breath caught in his chest as small stones began to rattle around him. The valley ahead was wide and barren, its cracked surface webbed with deep fissures that glowed faintly in the dim light. An unnatural silence hung over the landscape, broken only by the occasional groan of shifting rocks. Sarah glanced at him, her face pale but determined. Keep moving. Staying still might be worse. The group pressed forward, each step tentative, the weight of the earth's instability pressing on their minds. Cale gripped his sword tightly, his knuckles white against the hilt. Isolde whispered prayers under her breath, her hand clutching a charm carved with ancient runes. A sudden jolt threw them off balance as the ground heaved violently, forcing them to scramble for stability. A crack split the air, and a section of the valley floor collapsed into a chasm, its depths swallowing the remnants of what once might have been a pathway. Aiden's heart raced. "We can't cross this," he said, panic creeping into his voice. "Not unless we find another way," Cale muttered, his eyes scanning the jagged expanse. But as he spoke, the air around them grew heavy with an unfamiliar charge. It prickled against their skin, raising the hair on the back of their necks. From the far side of the chasm, a low rumble began to build, deep and resonant, like the growl of a slumbering beast. Out of the shadows emerged a figure, not human but not fully animal, a shape shimmering with an otherworldly glow. Its body was massive, its form undefined, shifting between solidity and mist. It moved with a deliberate grace, its eyes glowing like embers. The air seemed to bend around it, charged with a power that felt both ancient and raw. Isolde gasped, her voice trembling. An echo of the Thunderbird. The creature stood still for a moment, its presence overwhelming, its gaze locked onto the group. Then, without warning, it spread spectral wings, sending a gust of wind that whipped through the valley. The force was staggering, pushing them back and stirring the air into a swirling vortex. "We're being tested," Sarah shouted over the roar of the wind. "It won't let us pass unless we prove ourselves." Cale set his jaw, stepping forward despite the resistance. His voice was resolute. "Then we prove ourselves." The creature let out a sound, half roar, half cry, that resonated in their chests. The ground shook violently as the wind intensified, carrying with it fragments of rock and dust. Each of them fought to stay upright, their instincts screaming at them to run, but their resolve kept them rooted in place. Aiden reached for the talisman around his neck, his mind racing. He thought of the vision they'd seen, of the Thunderbird fighting against the shadows. Its power wasn't just destructive, it was protective, balanced. The thought gave him strength. "I'll go first," he said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his legs. Before anyone could argue, he stepped toward the chasm, his eyes locked on the spectral figure. He raised the talisman, holding it out like an offering. The creature's gaze shifted to him, and for a moment, the wind died down. The air felt thick, heavy with expectation. Aiden took another step. "We're here to protect this land," he said, his voice shaking but loud enough to carry. "We don't want to harm you. We just need to pass." The creature tilted its head, as though weighing his words. Then, slowly, it began to dissolve, its form breaking apart into fragments of light that swirled into the air. The wind subsided, and the earth beneath their feet steadied. "It's letting us through," Isolde whispered, her voice filled with awe. The chasm began to close, the fractured ground knitting itself back together until a narrow but stable path stretched before them. The group moved cautiously, the echoes of the encounter lingering in their minds. Beyond the valley, the dense forest awaited, its canopy a tangled web of branches and leaves that blotted out the sky. The air here was damp and heavy, carrying the scent of moss and decay. shadows moved at the edges of their vision, shapes that seemed to flicker between the trees. Cale tightened his grip on his weapon, his eyes darting from one shadow to the next. Something's watching us. The forest seemed alive, its silence oppressive. Every step felt deliberate, the crunch of leaves beneath their boots echoing unnaturally. They came to a clearing where the ground was covered in strange, spiraling patterns of stones and earth. Isolde knelt to examine them. "These are wards," she said. "Ancient ones. They're meant to protect, or trap." As if in response, the air grew colder, and the shadows coalesced into another form, a smaller creature, sleek and swift, with eyes like shards of ice. It moved with an unsettling speed, circling them in a blur. Sarah took a step forward, her hand outstretched. "It's testing us again," she said softly. "But this one's different." The creature stopped suddenly, its gaze locking onto her. For a moment, the two seemed to communicate without words, the tension in the air palpable. Then, the creature darted away, leaving a trail of frost in its wake. "It's gone," Cale said, though his voice held no relief. "No," Sarah replied. "It's watching. And it will be back if we stray." The group moved forward, their senses heightened, every rustle of leaves and snap of twigs setting their nerves on edge. They could feel the presence of the forest itself, ancient and unyielding, as though it were judging their every step. When they finally emerged from the woods, their relief was short-lived. Before them lay another challenge, a steep, rocky incline that led to a ridge overlooking the valley below. The climb was grueling, the rocks slick with moisture and loose underfoot. Halfway up, a sudden tremor caused a section of the ridge to collapse, sending Cale scrambling for a hold. Aiden lunged, grabbing his arm just in time to pull him to safety. "You all right?" Aiden asked, his breath coming in gasps. Cale nodded, his expression grim. "We don't have time to be careful." When they finally reached the top, the view stole their breath. The valley stretched out before them, bathed in the soft glow of twilight. In the distance, the faint outline of the sacred peak loomed, its summit hidden by swirling clouds. For a moment, the group stood in silence, the weight of their trials heavy on their minds. The landscape they had crossed seemed both beautiful and unforgiving, a testament to the power they sought to understand. Aiden felt a sense of quiet determination settle over him. The echoes of the Thunderbird's power were everywhere, testing their resolve, shaping their path. Each step brought them closer, not just to the peak, but to the truth they sought. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior that smelled of damp earth and old wood. The figure inside moved slowly, a hunched silhouette against the flickering light of a single candle. The group hesitated on the threshold, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Aiden stepped forward, his voice steady despite the unease coursing through him. "We were told you could help us," he said, addressing the shadowed figure. The old man, or so they assumed, straightened slightly, his face still obscured by the hood of a frayed cloak. When he spoke, his voice was like gravel, worn and heavy, each word deliberate. "You come seeking knowledge," he said, his tone more a statement than a question. "But knowledge is a dangerous thing." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one responded. The man turned, gesturing for them to follow. The room was cluttered with objects that seemed to hum with an ancient energy, carved stones, faded maps, and symbols etched into withered pieces of bark. Sarah glanced at Isolde, who nodded subtly, her expression cautious but curious. They followed the man deeper into the room, where he stopped before a small, uneven table. On it lay a single object, a leather-bound tome, its edges worn and its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shift when looked at too closely. The man placed a gnarled hand on the book. "You felt it, haven't you? The stirring beneath your feet. The storms that carry anger. The air that tastes of fear." He looked up, and for the first time, they saw his eyes, pale, clouded, yet piercing in their intensity. Aiden nodded. "We've seen the signs. We believe the Thunderbird is waking." The man's mouth twisted into something between a grimace and a smile. "The Thunderbird does not wake without reason. It stirs because the balance is threatened." But balance is a fragile thing. He opened the book, his hands trembling slightly, and turned the pages with a reverence that spoke of years spent guarding its secrets. The group leaned in, the dim light casting their shadows long and distorted on the walls. The page he stopped on showed an illustration, a great bird, its wings outstretched, standing above a swirling darkness. The Thunderbird, the man began, is a protector. A force of nature bound to the harmony of the world. But harmony does not come without sacrifice. He traced a finger along the drawing, his touch lingering on the darkness beneath the bird. What is it protecting us from? Isolde asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. The man looked up, his gaze heavy. Long ago, before memory became myth, there was a force that sought to consume this land. It was not fire or storm, but something far worse, something that devoured the spirit itself. The group exchanged uneasy glances. Kale's hand instinctively went to the hilt of his sword. It was the Thunderbird that stopped it, the man continued, his voice rising with a quiet intensity. It fought this force, driving it deep into the earth. But such a victory comes at a cost. The Thunderbird gave of itself, its power, its essence, to seal the evil away. And so it slept, bound to the land it had saved. But now it's waking, Sarah said, her tone edged with fear. Does that mean? The man interrupted, his voice sharp. It means the seal is weakening. The darkness stirs, just as the Thunderbird does. They are linked. One cannot rise without the other. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deeper. Aiden felt a chill run down his spine. So if the Thunderbird fully wakes, it will fight, the man said simply. But the outcome is not certain. If it is not guided, if its power falls into the wrong hands, the seal will break completely. And what lies beneath will rise again. Silence fell over the room, heavy and suffocating. The weight of the man's words pressed on them all, each grappling with the enormity of what they had learned. How do we stop it? Kale asked, his voice breaking the stillness. The man's expression darkened. Stopping it is not the question. Guiding it is. He closed the book, the sound echoing like a finality. The Thunderbird is not a creature to be controlled. It is a force, and forces must be aligned, not opposed. If you wish to save this world, you must prove to it that you are worthy of its trust. And if we fail? Isolde asked, though she already feared the answer. The man looked at her, his eyes seeming to pierce through her very being. If you fail, then the land will fail with you. The darkness will rise, and the Thunderbird's fury will become its own destruction. His words settled over them like a shroud, each grappling with the gravity of what lay ahead. The man turned away, his movements slow and deliberate. There is a place, he said after a long pause. A place where the Thunderbird's essence is strongest. It is there you must go. But be warned, the path is not one of strength alone. It will test you, break you, and demand more than you think you can give. Aiden stepped forward, his voice steady. We'll do whatever it takes. The man turned back to him, a flicker of something, hope, perhaps, in his pale eyes. Then you may have a chance. But understand this, the Thunderbird does not awaken for heroes. It awakens for balance. Remember that, and you may yet succeed. He handed the book to Aiden, his hands trembling. Take this. It may guide you further. But the rest will depend on you. The group left the room, the weight of the man's revelations heavy on their shoulders. Outside, the air felt colder, the wind carrying whispers of the storm that brewed on the horizon. As they walked away, the man stood at the doorway, watching them go. His figure was a shadow against the light, a guardian of secrets that were now theirs to bear. The ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble faintly, a reminder of the slumbering power and the great risk that lay ahead. The storm roared to life above them, a symphony of chaos. Lightning carved jagged streaks into the sky, each flash illuminating their faces, taut with tension. The wind howled with a force that seemed to carry a voice that screamed challenges they were too small to answer. Rain fell in torrents, soaking through their clothes and chilling them to the bone. Aiden struggled to stand against the gale, his hand gripping a jagged rock for support. Isolde, grab Kale, he shouted, his voice barely cutting through the storm's deafening wail. Kale had slipped, his footing lost on the slick ground. He clung to a narrow ledge, his fingers white with the strain. Isolde was already moving, her body low to the ground as she crawled toward him. The storm seemed to mock their efforts, each burst of thunder a reminder of their fragility. Kale's voice, strained and desperate, reached their ears. "Leave me. I'll pull you down with me." "Shut up." Isolde snapped, her tone cutting through his protests. "If I'm saving you, you don't get a say." Her hand shot out, gripping his wrist just as his strength faltered. She grunted with effort, her muscles trembling as she pulled him back onto the path. When they were both safely on the ground, Kale collapsed, gasping for air. "I told you." "And I ignored you," Isolde interrupted, brushing her wet hair out of her face. "You're not dying here. Not like this." Aiden reached them, his expression a mix of relief and exasperation. "We need to move. Now." They stumbled forward, the storm battering them from all sides. Each step felt like a battle, the wind and rain conspiring to break them. Sarah, who had been trailing behind, suddenly cried out. They turned to see her crouched low, clutching her arm. A branch, carried by the wind, had struck her shoulder. Kale, despite his earlier fall, was at her side in an instant. "You're hurt," he said, his voice softer now. "I'm fine," Sarah insisted, though her face betrayed the pain she was in. "You're not," Kale said firmly. He tore a strip from his cloak and tied it around her arm, securing it as best he could. Their eyes met, and in that brief moment, the tension between them melted away, replaced by something unspoken but understood. The group pressed on, their pace slow but steady. The storm showed no signs of relenting, its fury growing with each passing moment. Lightning struck a tree nearby, the force splitting it in two. The ground trembled beneath their feet. "What is this?" Sarah shouted, her voice tinged with fear. Aiden looked at the sky, his face pale. "A test," he said grimly. "It has to be." The realization hit them all at once. The storm wasn't just nature, it was something more. It was alive, watching them, weighing their worth. The wind seemed to shift, pushing them toward a rocky outcrop that offered a small reprieve from the rain. They collapsed there, their bodies battered and their spirits frayed. "This is impossible," Kale muttered, his voice thick with frustration. "We're being torn apart." "We're still here," Isolde said sharply. "That has to mean something." Aiden looked at each of them, his gaze steady despite the storm raging around them. "We didn't come this far to give up now. If this is a test, we pass it. Together." His words settled over them, a fragile shield against the storm. Sarah, her injured arm cradled against her chest, nodded. "Together," she echoed. Kale sighed, his anger giving way to determination. "Fine. Together." Isolde smirked, though the exhaustion in her eyes was impossible to hide. "Guess we're in agreement." The group huddled closer, their backs to the rock, their breaths mingling in the cold air. They shared no words, but in the silence, something shifted. The barriers between them, born of fear, doubt, and mistrust, began to crumble. When the storm surged again, they were ready. They moved as one, their steps more confident, their resolve unshaken. When Sarah stumbled, Kale caught her without hesitation. When Kale faltered, Isolde offered a steadying hand. Aiden led the way, his voice a beacon in the chaos. As they climbed higher, the storm seemed to push harder, as if testing the strength of their newfound unity. They met its challenge head-on, each step a declaration of their resolve. When they finally reached a plateau, the storm abruptly ceased. The silence that followed was deafening, the absence of chaos leaving a void that was both unsettling and profound. The group stood together, their breaths ragged, their bodies battered but unbroken. The sky above them was dark, the clouds heavy with a promise they couldn't yet decipher. But for the first time, they felt a spark of hope. Whatever comes next, Aiden said, his voice steady, we face it. Together. And as they stood there, a bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating their faces. It wasn't a threat this time, it was a promise, a bond forged in the storm's fury, unyielding and unbreakable. The wind carried a strange stillness as they crested the ridge. Below, a valley stretched wide, its floor littered with massive shards of stone and twisted, ancient trees. The air felt heavy, as though the ground itself remembered something too painful to release. Isolde was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. This place, it's wrong. Aiden crouched to touch the ground, his fingers brushing over blackened soil. No, he murmured. Not wrong. Broken. The others spread out, their boots crunching over brittle debris. They found enormous feathers, their once bright colors now dulled by time. The shafts were splintered, some snapped clean in half. Kale lifted one, its weight surprising. Is this? Sarah nodded, her expression grim. Thunderbird. The group froze as the realization settled over them. This wasn't just any sight. This was where the Thunderbird had fought and fallen. The evidence was everywhere, woven into the landscape like scars on skin. Massive gouges in the earth spoke of claws that had raked through rock. Trees were splintered and twisted, their branches reaching skyward like frozen screams. A massive boulder lay cracked in two, its surface slick with moss that couldn't quite hide the scorched marks seared into it. Sarah knelt beside a shallow pool that reflected the dull gray sky. At its center lay a shard of metal, jagged and blackened. She picked it up, her fingers trembling. What is it? Kale asked, stepping closer. She turned it over in her hands. A talon, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Or what's left of one. The group gathered around, their breaths shallow as they stared at the relic. It was massive, nearly the length of Sarah's arm, and its edges were worn but sharp. What could have done this? Isolde asked, breaking the silence. The prophecy, Aiden said, his voice steady but heavy with meaning. The great evil, the Thunderbird seal. It wasn't just a legend. It's real. Kale scoffed, though his voice lacked its usual bite. You're saying something could fight that? He gestured to the valley, to the feathers and the claw marks and the broken trees. Yes, Aiden said simply. And it nearly won. The group fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. They had always known the Thunderbird was powerful, a force of nature. But this battlefield spoke of a struggle that was raw and devastating, the kind that left nothing untouched. As they moved deeper into the valley, the remnants of the battle became even more harrowing. They found bones, some small, likely those of animals caught in the chaos, but others far larger, their shapes foreign and unsettling. Aiden stopped abruptly, his gaze fixed on a massive stone arch that jutted out of the ground at an unnatural angle. It was cracked and weathered, but carvings were still visible on its surface. What is that? Isolde asked, following his gaze. A marker, Aiden said. Or a warning. They approached cautiously, the air around the arch colder than the rest of the valley. The carvings depicted scenes of struggle, a massive bird, its wings outstretched, facing a shadowy figure. The figure was indistinct, its form shifting and unclear, but its presence was unmistakable. Sarah traced the carvings with her fingers, her expression troubled. It fought to protect us, she said, her voice barely audible. And it paid the price. Kale clenched his fists, his jaw tight. So what now? We just wait for history to repeat itself? No, Aiden said firmly. We learn from this. His eyes scanned the carvings, searching for answers. Then he saw it, a small symbol etched near the base of the arch. It was simple, just a spiral surrounded by jagged lines, but it caught his attention. What does it mean? Sarah asked, noticing his focus. I don't know, Aiden admitted. But it's important. I can feel it. Isolde knelt beside him, her brow furrowed. Could it be a location? A map? Maybe, Aiden said. Or a warning. As they stood there, the wind picked up again, carrying a low, mournful sound. It wasn't the shriek of the storm, but something deeper, more resonant. It wrapped around them, filling the valley with a sense of loss so profound it brought tears to their eyes. "This place remembers," Sarah said softly. Cale turned away, his face hard. "Then we'd better not forget." The group moved on, each step heavier than the last. They knew they couldn't stay in the valley forever, but leaving felt like a betrayal, like they were abandoning a story that deserved to be told. When they reached the edge of the battlefield, they turned for one last look. The broken feathers, the splintered trees, the scarred earth, it all felt like a plea. "We'll honor this," Aiden said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "And we'll make sure it wasn't in vain." The wind swirled around them one final time, carrying a sound that almost felt like a whisper. It wasn't language, not exactly, but they understood it all the same. Remember. The first sign was the quiet. For days, the group had moved through rugged terrain with the hum of life surrounding them, chirping insects, rustling leaves, the distant cries of birds. But now, silence pressed in on all sides, thick and suffocating. Isolde stopped mid-step, her hand tightening on the hilt of her blade. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice low. Aiden's eyes darted to the horizon. "No," he replied, his tone grim. "And that's the problem." Cale drew his weapon, his movements deliberate. "We're not alone," he said, scanning the ridges above them. Before anyone could respond, the first arrow struck the ground. It quivered there, a warning more than an attack. But the second arrow was not so kind. It sliced through the air, grazing Cale's shoulder. "Ambush," he shouted, diving for cover behind a cluster of rocks. The world exploded into chaos. Shadows moved in the distance, figures blending into the landscape with practiced ease. Arrows rained down, forcing the group to scatter. Aiden yelled something, orders, perhaps, but his voice was lost in the roar of battle. Sarah crouched behind a fallen tree, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She clutched the talon they had found in the valley, its edges digging into her palm. She hadn't been trained for this, none of them had, not really. A flash of movement caught her eye. A figure darted toward her, their blade gleaming in the dim light. Panic surged, but then Isolde was there, her sword meeting the attackers with a sharp, metallic clang. "Stay low." Isolde barked, her focus never wavering from the enemy. Sarah nodded, scrambling backward as Isolde dispatched the assailant with brutal efficiency. Meanwhile, Cale was holding his own against two attackers. His movements were quick, almost reckless, but every swing of his blade found its mark. "You call this a fight?" he shouted, a grin splitting his face despite the blood trickling down his arm. Aiden, however, was not so fortunate. A blow to his side sent him sprawling, his staff clattering to the ground. The shadowy figure who had struck him loomed closer, their weapon raised. But before the strike could land, a burst of energy shot through the air, knocking the attacker off their feet. Aiden looked up to see Sarah standing above him, her eyes wide with fear but her hand steady. "Are you okay?" she asked, helping him to his feet. He nodded, wincing as he moved. "Thanks to you." The skirmish dragged on, each side testing the other's strength. But it became clear that the attackers had the advantage. They were organized, their movements precise. The group, by contrast, was ragged, fighting not out of strategy but desperation. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the assault stopped. The attackers retreated into the shadows, their footsteps fading into the distance. The group stood there, battered and bloodied, their breaths harsh in the still air. "Why did they leave?" Cale asked, his voice tinged with suspicion. "Because they didn't need to stay," Aiden said grimly. He pointed to the ground where the attackers had first appeared. A symbol had been carved into the earth, a spiral surrounded by jagged lines. "The same symbol," Sarah whispered, her eyes widening. "From the valley." Isolde crouched beside it, her expression dark. "This wasn't just an attack," she said. "It was a message." Cale scoffed, his frustration boiling over. "Great. So not only are they trying to kill us, they're sending cryptic notes while they're at it. It's more than that, Aiden said, his gaze fixed on the symbol. They're warning us. Or taunting us. Either way, they know what we're after. The realization hit them like a physical blow. They weren't just fighting for their lives, they were fighting for something much larger. Sarah's voice broke the silence, trembling but resolute. They're trying to stop us from reaching the Thunderbird. And they'll keep trying, Isolde said, rising to her feet. Her gaze swept over the group, lingering on their injuries. We need to be ready. Aiden placed a hand on her shoulder. We will be, he said. We have to be. As they gathered their supplies and tended to their wounds, the weight of the encounter settled over them. This was no longer a question of if they could succeed, but whether they could survive long enough to try. The sky darkened above them, storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The air crackled with tension, as though the land itself was holding its breath. And somewhere, hidden among the shadows, their enemies watched and waited. The world felt suspended in time. Sarah stood at the edge of the ancient circle, her heart pounding in her chest. The stones that surrounded her, worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain, pulsed faintly with a light she couldn't explain. The air felt heavy, alive with something unseen. Her breath was shallow, her fingers trembling as they clutched the Talon artifact close to her chest. Are you sure about this? Kale's voice broke through the silence, but it sounded distant, muffled. She didn't respond. Something was calling her, a pull so powerful it drowned out her fear. A flicker of light danced at the corner of her vision, and she turned her head. In the sky above, the storm clouds churned with unnatural fury, their edges crackling with veins of white-hot lightning. A low hum began to build, not from outside but within her, a resonance that seemed to echo through her bones. She dropped to her knees, unable to stand under the weight of the sound. And then, everything changed. The circle of stones erupted in light, blinding and pure. Sarah gasped as the world around her melted away. The forest, the storm, her companions, all faded into an endless expanse of glowing white. For a terrifying moment, she thought she might have died. But then, in the vastness, a presence stirred. It was immense, overwhelming. She couldn't see it, but she could feel it, a force that filled every corner of the space, ancient and unyielding. The air vibrated with power, and then, finally, the voice came. You seek me, little one. The words were not spoken aloud but etched into her very being. The voice was deep, resonant, carrying the weight of countless millennia. It wasn't angry, but there was a sorrow in it so profound that it made Sarah's chest ache. She struggled to speak, her voice barely a whisper. Are you, the Thunderbird? The presence shifted, like the rolling of distant thunder. I am what you call me. I am the guardian of the skies, the keeper of balance. But I am also more than you can comprehend. Sarah's hands clenched in the fabric of her cloak. Why are you sorrowful? She asked, the question tumbling out before she could stop it. The space around her seemed to dim, and the sorrow in the voice deepened. Because I have watched. I have seen the greed of your kind, the ceaseless hunger for more. The forests that once sang with life now lie silent. The rivers that once danced are poisoned. You take and take, never giving back. You disrupt the balance. The words pierced her like shards of ice. Images flooded her mind, forests reduced to ash, animals fleeing as machines tore through the earth, rivers choked with waste. She saw it all, not as distant memories, but as if she were standing there, helpless to stop it. I'm sorry, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. The voice softened, though the sorrow remained. It is not you alone. It is all of you, together. I slumbered, hoping that humanity might find its way. But I have been awakened, and now I see that the balance is tipping beyond repair. A sudden crack of thunder reverberated through the space, sharp and angry. Sarah flinched, clutching the Talon tighter. What can I do? She asked, her voice trembling. What can we do? The presence was silent for a long moment, and she feared it might not answer. But then, the voice returned, steady and firm. Understand this, the balance is not mine to keep. It is yours. You are part of this world, yet you act as though you are above it. If humanity cannot change, then I will bring the storm to cleanse what has been lost. It is not my choice, but the law of existence. What is broken must either mend or be swept away. The weight of the words crushed her, leaving her breathless. She thought of her companions, of their struggles and fears. She thought of the villages they had passed, of the people who depended on the land. Could they change? Could they undo the harm that had been done? The voice softened once more. You have a chance, little one. A single chance to prove that humanity can restore what it has broken. But know this, if you fail, the storm will not spare you. Sarah's resolve hardened. She might have been small, insignificant in the face of such power, but she could not walk away. We won't fail, she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. The presence seemed to watch her, though she could not see it. We shall see, it said, the sorrow still lingering in its tone. The light around her began to fade, the vastness shrinking. The hum in her chest ebbed, replaced by the sound of the storm outside. And then, with a final surge of energy, she was back in the circle of stones. Her knees hit the ground, and she gasped for air, clutching the talon as though it were her lifeline. Around her, the forest had returned, the storm raging above. Her companions rushed to her side, their faces etched with worry. What happened? Cale demanded, his eyes scanning her for injuries. She looked up at him, her heart still pounding. I heard it, she said, her voice barely audible. I heard the Thunderbird. Aiden knelt beside her, his expression grave. What did it say? She met his gaze, the weight of the words pressing down on her. It said we have one chance to set things right. The storm overhead cracked with another bolt of lightning, as if punctuating her words. The group exchanged glances, the enormity of the moment sinking in. And in the distance, the thunder rolled, a reminder of the voice that would not be forgotten. The moon hung high in the sky, its pale light casting long shadows on the forest floor. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the promise of something dangerous, something inevitable. Sarah and her companions had traveled for days, their spirits weary but their resolve firm. The Thunderbird's call had set them on this path, and they couldn't afford to turn back now. They had stopped to make camp by a small clearing, the fire crackling in the center, its warm glow contrasting with the cold night air. The tension between them was palpable, but it wasn't just the weight of the mission that hung over their heads. Something had shifted, something unseen but deeply felt. Sarah sat by the fire, absently turning the Talon artifact in her hands. Her thoughts were heavy with the voice of the Thunderbird, the warning, the prophecy. Could they truly save the world? Could they heal what had been broken? And yet, as she gazed into the flames, something gnawed at the back of her mind, a sense that all wasn't as it seemed. It was then that she heard it, soft footsteps approaching from behind. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Cale's presence was unmistakable, his strong, steady presence a comfort, even in the midst of uncertainty. But tonight, something was different. His footsteps were too quiet, almost too deliberate. Sarah, Cale's voice was low, but it held an edge of something she couldn't quite place. Can we talk? She nodded, her stomach tightening. Of course. Cale stepped closer, his shadow falling over her as he crouched down beside the fire. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The crackling of the fire was the only sound, its warmth doing little to ease the coldness that seemed to have settled between them. What's going on, Cale? Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. You've been distant for the last few days. We all have, but there's something about you. Cale's eyes flickered with something, fear, anger, or maybe guilt. She couldn't tell. For a moment, he just stared at the flames, his hands fidgeting in his lap. Then, with a deep breath, he finally spoke, his words heavy with a weight she hadn't expected. I've been keeping something from you, he said, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The air seemed to thicken, the wind now whispering words she couldn't understand. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. Something was wrong. Something was about to change. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice tight with confusion. Kale met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw the darkness in his eyes. The shadow that had been lurking there for days, hidden behind his strength and stoic demeanor, now came to the surface. He took a deep breath, then spoke in a voice that made Sarah's blood run cold. "I'm not here to save the world, Sarah. I'm here to control it." The words hit her like a slap, the shock making her dizzy. She recoiled, her hand instinctively tightening around the talon as if it were her only lifeline. Her breath caught in her throat, unable to believe what she had just heard. "What are you saying?" she managed, her voice barely a whisper. You're not with us?" Kale's eyes darkened further, and for the first time, Sarah saw the full extent of the lie he had been weaving. He was no longer the Kale she had trusted, the one who had fought alongside them with unwavering loyalty. This was someone else. Someone who had been waiting for this moment all along. "I never was," he admitted, his voice steady now, free from the hesitation that had once defined him. "The Thunderbird is a weapon, Sarah. Not a savior. And I've been sent to ensure that its power doesn't fall into the wrong hands, yours included." The ground beneath her seemed to shift. The firelight danced in Kale's eyes, a cold, calculating glint that sent a shiver down her spine. The weight of his betrayal pressed in on her chest, suffocating her. "What do you mean?" she breathed, her voice trembling. "You've been lying to us this whole time?" Kale's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Lying? No. I've been playing the part. And I did it well, didn't I? You trusted me. I let you believe I was part of this mission, part of this cause. But the truth is, I've been working against you from the start." Sarah's mind spun, struggling to process the impossible reality. She had fought beside Kale. They had shared campfires, fought battles together. He had always been there, a steady presence she could count on. And now, everything was shattered. The foundation she had built her trust on crumbled beneath her feet. "But why?" Her voice cracked, the hurt raw and exposed. "Why would you do this? We were supposed to be saving the world. What happened to that?" Kale's expression softened, but only for a moment. The hardness returned quickly, and he spoke again, his words cutting deep. "The world is beyond saving, Sarah. It's already been decided. The storm is coming, and the Thunderbird will awaken. It will either tear everything apart or reshape it in a new image. But I'm here to make sure that I'm the one who controls it, not you." Sarah's heart ached, the betrayal sinking in like a heavy stone. Her thoughts raced, trying to find the pieces of the puzzle that had slipped out of place. But there was no denying the truth now. Kale wasn't just a companion. He was an obstacle, a barrier between them and the power they needed to save the world. And yet, she didn't know how to fight him. She had trusted him with everything, her life, her mission, her heart. The very idea that he had been using her felt like a cruel joke, one that she hadn't been able to see until it was too late. A voice broke through the silence, sharp and filled with fury. It was Aiden, storming toward them. "What's going on here?" But Kale didn't hesitate. He stood, his eyes locking with Sarah's one last time, his voice cold and final. "The choice has already been made, Sarah. I hope you can live with it." And before she could react, before she could even process what had happened, Kale was gone, disappearing into the shadows of the forest, leaving only the faintest echo of his betrayal behind. Sarah stood there, frozen, her heart heavy with disbelief. The wind howled through the trees, the storm above still raging. But the most terrifying thing of all was the silence between them, the crack that had formed in the heart of their group, a wound that might never heal. The ground trembled beneath their feet, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to echo from deep within the earth. Sarah froze, her hand instinctively reaching out for the nearest companion. The air thickened, dense and heavy, as though the very atmosphere was holding its breath. There was a stillness that was unnatural, an eerie calm before something monumental would shift. And then, without warning, it came. the sky above them split open with a deafening roar. A crack of thunder, so loud and intense, it felt as though the heavens themselves had shattered. The world seemed to tilt, as if the earth was rising up to meet the heavens in one massive collision. The storm, once distant, was now upon them, its fury unstoppable. The wind screamed, wild and untamed, tearing through the trees and whipping the dirt into the air. Lightning arced across the sky, so blinding that for a moment, Sarah couldn't see, couldn't breathe. Every inch of her body felt as if it were being pulled apart by the force of the storm. It was not just a storm, it was something alive, something with a purpose. And at that moment, she knew, with an icy certainty, that the Thunderbird was awakening. The sound of the thunderclap, impossibly loud and full of raw power, seemed to split the very fabric of reality. The landscape, once familiar and steady, began to distort, the trees bending in unnatural angles as though the storm itself was reshaping the world around them. The earth cracked open in places, and from those cracks, something ancient, something primal, stirred. The air smelled like ozone, sharp and metallic, as the ground heaved once more. The very earth seemed to be alive, vibrating beneath their feet, and Sarah could feel it in her bones. The Thunderbird was calling, and they were all caught in its wake. "Get down!" Aiden shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her to the ground as the winds howled like wild beasts overhead. The others were already huddled together, crouching low to avoid being thrown off their feet by the force of the storm. Sarah's heart raced as she looked around, her mind struggling to process the chaos. The storm was like nothing she had ever witnessed, the sky alive with bolts of lightning that twisted and spun as though dancing to a rhythm only it could hear. She could feel the power in the air, crackling around her, charging the very air they breathed. And then, through the storm's furious clamor, she heard it, the voice. It was low, a rumbling vibration deep in her chest. It was not a sound she could hear with her ears, but something she could feel in the very core of her being. The Thunderbird was speaking, but not with words. The message was clear in the pulse of the earth, in the crackling of the air, in the way the storm swirled with an energy too ancient for them to fully comprehend. The sky darkened further, swirling with the kind of blackness that seemed to choke out the light. In that moment, Sarah thought she saw it, a massive shape, barely visible through the storm, moving across the sky like a shadow of the ancient creature. It was as if the Thunderbird itself was not just part of the storm, but the storm itself, its wings flapping with a power that could split the world apart. The wind screamed again, and suddenly, with a force that took her breath away, a bolt of lightning streaked down, striking the earth nearby. The ground shook violently beneath them, the force of the strike sending shockwaves through the air. A deafening crack filled the air as trees were ripped from their roots and thrown like toys in the storm's fury. Sarah's ears rang, her heart pounding so hard in her chest that it nearly drowned out everything else. She could taste the bitterness of the storm on her lips, a sharp, metallic tang that made her stomach twist. The sky was alive with energy, raw, untamed power that was both beautiful and terrifying. And then, the storm began to wane. Slowly at first, but with growing intensity, it began to pull back, like a curtain being drawn after a show. The wind eased, the lightning's fury dimmed, and the thunder that had once felt so all-encompassing now became a distant rumble. But the sky did not return to normal. The clouds still swirled, dark and menacing, as though something far more ancient than a mere storm still lingered in the air. The ground had shifted, the landscape forever changed by the raw power of the Thunderbird's partial awakening. Sarah, heart still racing, lifted her head from where she had been crouched, her eyes wide. The world had shifted. Something had broken free. The Thunderbird had risen, if only for a moment, and left its mark. "We've seen it," Aiden's voice was low, almost reverent. "It's coming." Sarah didn't respond. Her mind was still processing, still absorbing the weight of what they had just witnessed. Her hands trembled, but not from fear. She could feel it in her bones, the immense power that had just brushed against the earth. They had been caught in the storm's wake, but the storm wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The Thunderbird had awoken, but it wasn't done. Not yet. The storm wasn't just a warning. It was a promise. And as the last remnants of the lightning faded into the horizon, the truth began to settle in her chest. They were running out of time. The land was scarred, reshaped by the Thunderbird's power, and Sarah could only imagine what would happen when the full force of the creature finally made its arrival. Would it be a salvation, as the prophecy had promised? Or would it be destruction, a reckoning that none of them could survive? But before those answers could come, they had to survive the storm that had just passed, and the storm that was yet to come. The wind howled as the group ascended the jagged mountain path, each step a battle against the elements. The air was thin, cold, and bitter, but the real challenge was not the climb itself, it was the weight of what lay ahead. Every member of the group felt it, an unspoken tension hanging in the air, as though the mountain itself was aware of their presence and watching, waiting. They weren't just climbing a peak. They were approaching something sacred, something ancient. And it was no longer willing to remain hidden. The higher they climbed, the harder the winds blew, fierce gusts that seemed to push them back, as though testing their resolve. The rocks underfoot were slick with frost, sharp edges like teeth ready to sink into their skin. The world around them had transformed into a place of raw, untamed power. The landscape was barren, harsh, a reflection of the immense strength they were about to face. Sarah could feel it in her bones, something was different. The air crackled with energy, a static charge that hummed in the back of her mind. She knew they were close, but how close, she could not say. All she knew was that they had reached the place where the Thunderbird had once rested, a place now guarded by something far older than the legends. The final stretch of the climb was steep, almost vertical. They had to scale the cliff face with nothing but their hands and feet, the wind pushing against them with such force that it felt like the mountain itself was trying to keep them away. But it wasn't the wind that made Sarah's heart race. It was the sudden, heavy stillness that filled the air as they reached the summit. The moment they stepped onto the flat, rocky plateau, the atmosphere changed. It wasn't the same sharp, biting cold they had felt on the way up. Instead, the air was thick, charged with an unnatural energy, as though the very ground they stood on was alive. The rocks beneath their feet seemed to hum with a low, steady vibration, a resonance that seemed to echo through their bones. And then, Sarah saw it. At the center of the plateau, surrounded by ancient, weathered stone pillars, lay a massive, flattened stone slab. The stone was smooth, but not from natural erosion. It was as if it had been shaped by hands far more powerful than any human's. The air around it shimmered, rippling with the intensity of something that had been sealed away for centuries, if not millennia. The Thunderbird's resting place. The sight sent a chill down Sarah's spine, but there was no time to linger. They had come too far, and they knew the storm was closing in. They needed to understand what lay beneath this place, to understand the power that slumbered here, but as they moved forward, the air grew heavier, more oppressive. Without warning, a brilliant light flashed before them, so intense that it blinded Sarah for a split second. She staggered back, heart pounding. The others seemed just as shocked, and they quickly shielded their eyes, unsure of what was happening. Then came the voice. Not a voice that could be heard, but a feeling, a pressure in the mind. The air around them thickened, and from the very ground beneath their feet, ancient symbols began to glow with an eerie, otherworldly light. These symbols, strange and foreign, danced across the surface of the stone slab, weaving together in a complex pattern that Sarah could not begin to understand. Aiden stepped forward, his face tight with determination. He reached out, hand trembling, and brushed against the stone. The moment his fingers made contact, a violent tremor shot through the air, and the symbols flared to life, bright and searing. "Wards," he muttered under his breath, his voice filled with awe and fear. Ancient wards to protect the Thunderbird. To keep anyone from disturbing its resting place. The symbols glowed brighter, and a hum of power vibrated through the ground, sending ripples through the very air. Sarah could feel the weight of it, the immense power that surged through the earth and into the stone, holding them back, warning them. The wind picked up again, fierce and unrelenting. It whipped around them, pulling at their clothes, tugging at their skin. But this time, it wasn't the natural force of the mountain's wind. This was something far more purposeful. The air seemed to vibrate with a voice that was not spoken but felt, something ancient and powerful, speaking directly to them. "You are not welcome here," the voice whispered, a rush of energy flowing through the words. The words were not spoken aloud, but they rang in Sarah's head, clear and unmistakable. It was as if the very mountain itself was speaking to them, its voice filled with centuries of knowledge and caution. "Leave," it continued, the pressure in the air growing heavier, as though the very ground was warning them to turn back. But the group did not move. They had come too far to stop now, and despite the warning, they pressed on. Aiden, ever the leader, stepped forward again, his hand steady as he touched the stone. His fingers brushed over the symbols, tracing their intricate patterns, trying to unlock the secret that held the Thunderbird's power in place. The storm clouds overhead darkened, swirling ominously as if reacting to their presence. The air was thick with anticipation, charged with energy that made Sarah's hair stand on end. She could feel the power surrounding them, ancient and untamed. It was a force that demanded respect, but also fear. This was not a place meant for mortals. This was a place where the divine slumbered, and to disturb it was to risk everything. "Do you understand what this means?" Aiden asked, his voice tight with determination. His eyes met Sarah's for a moment, and in them, she saw the weight of their mission, the gravity of their purpose. They weren't just here to wake the Thunderbird. They were here to face whatever lay beneath it, to confront the ancient evil that had been sealed away by this very force. And the wars were just the beginning. The Thunderbird had once fought to protect the world, and now, its resting place stood as a silent sentinel, a warning to all who dared to come too close. But they had no choice. The storm was coming, and so was the battle they had to fight. The only question was, would they survive it? The moment the group stepped into the temple, the air shifted. It was as if the clouds themselves had swallowed them whole, closing in around them. The sky was no longer a distant expanse, but a thick, swirling fog, heavy with the weight of 1,000 years. They stood on a precipice, suspended in the sky, surrounded by towering columns that seemed to rise out of the very mist. The ground beneath their feet was smooth and cold, but not in the way stone should feel. It was alive, vibrating with a pulse of energy so subtle yet so strong that it hummed in their bones. The temple was built high above the earth, so high that the world below seemed distant, unimportant. Here, at this unimaginable height, they could almost feel the Thunderbird's presence. It was a place that had been untouched for centuries, protected by the clouds and the winds, a place where the sky and the earth met, as though nature itself had conspired to keep the power of the Thunderbird hidden from mortal eyes. The group moved cautiously, each step echoing loudly in the silence. Their breath came in short bursts, fogging in the cool, thin air. The walls of the temple were etched with intricate carvings, symbols, and designs that none of them could fully comprehend. There was a beauty to it, a mysterious elegance in the way the patterns seemed to shift and change as they moved past them. But the beauty was not the only thing that caught Sarah's attention. It was the overwhelming sense of something ancient and heavy, pressing in around them. They were not alone here. They stopped before an enormous set of stone doors, their surface marked with the same glowing symbols they had seen at the Thunderbird's resting place. The air here was thick with a kind of stillness that set Sarah's heart racing. The doors looked like they had not been opened in centuries, their edges frayed with age, yet they held a quiet, undeniable power. Above them, the figure of the Thunderbird was carved in painstaking detail, its wings spread wide, its eyes staring down, unblinking, fierce, and eternal. "This is it," Aiden said, his voice tight with awe. "The heart of the temple." Sarah could feel it too, something in the air, a magnetic pull that made her want to step forward, to push those doors open and discover what lay beyond them. But they weren't ready. Not yet. They needed to understand the temple's secrets first, to unlock the ancient mechanisms that would allow them to proceed. Lena, ever the pragmatist, stepped forward first. She ran her fingers over the stone, tracing the glowing symbols. "There's a puzzle here," she murmured, her brow furrowed in concentration. "We need to align the symbols, each representing an element. Wind, rain, lightning, and earth. But they have to be in the right order." A hush fell over them as the weight of Lena's words sank in. This wasn't just a simple puzzle, it was a test. A trial to prove that they were worthy of the knowledge hidden within these walls. The Thunderbird's temple was not a place meant for just anyone. It was meant for those who understood the balance of nature, the very forces that had once shaped the world. And they had to prove themselves worthy before the doors would open to them. Lena knelt before the first symbol, the swirling wind, and placed her hand upon it. The air around them stirred, just a whisper of movement, as though the wind itself had responded to her touch. The symbol glowed briefly, and then dimmed, as if waiting for the next step. Rain, Sarah whispered, her voice hoarse, as she stepped forward to the next symbol. She placed her hand on it gently, as if to coax it into life. A soft mist appeared, drifting up from the stone. It was light at first, but then it began to grow, swirling around them, thickening into a steady downpour. The rain smelled fresh, clean, like a summer storm. As the mist enveloped them, Sarah's skin tingled with an electric charge, a reminder of the power that surged through the temple, waiting to be awakened. The thunder symbol was next. The group hesitated, but Aiden was the first to step forward, his hand resting on the jagged lines of the symbol. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ground trembled, a low, rumbling growl deep beneath their feet. The walls of the temple vibrated, and a flash of lightning lit up the sky, bright and blinding. The thunder shook them to their core, a violent roar that echoed through the mountains, as though the Thunderbird itself had stirred from its slumber, angry and restless. But they were not yet finished. There was one last symbol to activate, the earth. Lena looked to Sarah, and the two shared a brief, unspoken moment of understanding. The earth was the foundation, the stabilizer, the silent force that held everything together. They needed to connect with it, to feel the weight of it beneath them. Sarah knelt beside the stone, placing her hands flat against the surface. The ground beneath her felt solid, but it was more than that. It felt ancient, wise, as though it had witnessed the birth of time itself. And as she focused, she could feel the energy shift. The earth rumbled softly in response, and the final symbol flared with light. For a moment, the entire temple seemed to pulse with life, as though the very stones were alive, breathing in sync with the group. And then, the doors creaked open. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible, but it filled the temple with a quiet power. Slowly, the massive stone doors parted, revealing the inner sanctum. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. This was it. They had made it past the first test, but the real challenge lay ahead. The Thunderbird's resting place was beyond these doors, and whatever they would find there would determine not only their fate, but the fate of the world. But for now, they stood at the threshold, in the very heart of the storm, surrounded by the sacred elements. They had unlocked the secrets of the Sky Temple. They had proven themselves worthy, and the Thunderbird was watching. The moment Sarah's fingers brushed the relic, a jolt of energy surged through her, sharp and electric, as if the air itself had split open. Her breath caught in her throat, and the world around her seemed to pause. Her heart pounded, but it wasn't just the sudden rush of power that made her pulse race, it was the sense that something ancient, something profound, was calling to her. The relic was warm, glowing faintly with a light that seemed to shift like lightning, never quite still, yet never fading. It was not just an artifact. It was alive. The sensation in her hands was more than just a touch. It felt as though she had connected with something deep within the earth itself, something timeless and all-encompassing. And in that moment, a vision exploded inside her mind, so vivid it was almost painful. Her body swayed, unsteady on her feet, and the world around her blurred. The edges of the temple seemed to dissolve, the walls vanishing, replaced by a vast, storm-lashed sky. The wind howled in her ears, and the ground beneath her seemed to tremble with a power that made her bones ache. She was no longer in the temple, she was flying, soaring above mountains and forests, above rivers and valleys, her wings beating with the force of 1,000 storms. It wasn't her own body she felt, it was the Thunderbird's. She could feel the rush of the air beneath her, the pull of the earth below, the crackle of electricity in her feathers. She wasn't just flying. She was alive, alive in a way she had never known. The Thunderbird's essence surged through her, flooding her mind with images, flash after flash, moments of victory and moments of loss, power and destruction, creation and devastation. She saw the Thunderbird battling a force that had been born in the shadows, a darkness that sought to choke the world. The Thunderbird fought with everything it had, its wings beating like thunder, its lightning streaking across the sky, a beacon of hope. But the darkness was relentless, a creeping, consuming force that seemed to take root in every corner of the world. The visions were so overwhelming that Sarah had to close her eyes, though they still burned behind her eyelids. She felt as though she were drowning in them, sinking deeper and deeper into a history she had no way of fully understanding. Her heart raced with the urgency of the Thunderbird struggle, with the agony of a battle that had no clear victor, only a fragile hope that hung in the balance. And then, in the midst of the chaos, a voice. Not one she could hear, but one she could feel, inside her very soul. It was a deep, resonant sound, like thunder rumbling in the distance. The Thunderbird spoke to her, but not in words. It was something more, a truth, a feeling that poured into her with such force that it took her breath away. She understood, suddenly, the depth of its sorrow. She felt the weight of the world pressing down on the creature's wings, the burden of knowing that the balance of all life was in jeopardy. The Thunderbird had fought, but it had lost. The evil that it had tried to imprison had found a way to rise again, to break free. And now, it was returning. But the Thunderbird's power was not infinite. The strength it had summoned once was now fading, leaving it vulnerable. And in that vulnerability, Sarah felt a tremor of fear, not for herself, but for what was to come. The vision shifted again. She saw the Thunderbirds retreat into the earth, its wings folding in on themselves, its form sinking beneath the surface as it sealed away the evil it had fought so fiercely. But the seal was not perfect. There were cracks, tiny fissures in the earth, where the darkness had seeped through. And now, it was beginning to rise again. The relic pulsed in Sarah's hands, and she could feel its connection to the Thunderbird's energy deepening, growing stronger. It wasn't just a symbol of power, it was a part of the Thunderbird, a piece of its essence. And it had been waiting. Waiting for the one who could wield it. Her fingers clenched around the relic as she stumbled back to the present. The world around her snapped back into focus, the temple walls solid once more, the swirling mist of the sky and the thunderous winds gone, replaced by the quiet of the temple's interior. But the feeling lingered. The power. The weight. The responsibility. The Thunderbird had chosen her. She could feel it in her bones. It had given her its essence, its heart, its very soul. And now, it was up to her to carry it forward. Her heart pounded, but not from fear. There was something else now, a spark of determination that burned deep within her chest. She had seen the vision. She had felt the Thunderbird's sorrow, its regret, and its hope. She understood, now, the burden it carried. It wasn't just a matter of saving the world. It was about balance. The Thunderbird had once fought to protect it, and now it was her turn. The relic had granted her the knowledge she needed, but it had also given her a choice. She could walk away, leave the Thunderbird's power behind. Or she could take it up, carry it within her, and stand against the darkness that threatened to consume them all. For a long moment, she simply stood there, feeling the weight of the decision settle over her. But the choice was already made. It was in her hands now. The relic wasn't just a tool, it was a promise. A promise to protect the balance of life, to fight the darkness, to carry the Thunderbird's heart within her own. And as she looked around at the others, her comrades, those who had stood by her side, who had fought alongside her, she knew they were all bound by the same force. The same responsibility. The same heart. The power of the Thunderbird was within them all now, and they would carry it forward, together. The storm was coming, but they were ready. And in that moment, Sarah understood the true meaning of the Thunderbird's essence. It wasn't just power. It was sacrifice. It was the willingness to carry the weight of the world, no matter how heavy, no matter how impossible. And it was that sacrifice that would save them all. The air trembled with an energy so fierce that it felt alive. Each breath was heavy, as though the atmosphere had thickened with the weight of something ancient stirring. Sarah stood frozen, her eyes locked on the horizon. The storm clouds churned like living things, black and swollen with wrath, illuminated by bursts of lightning that turned the sky into a flickering, electric canvas. The sound wasn't just thunder, it was a roar, a declaration of something massive and unyielding. And then, it emerged. The Thunderbird tore through the clouds with a force that made the earth itself shudder. Its wings were vast, stretching so wide they seemed to span the heavens. Feathers glinted like shards of obsidian, their edges sparking with raw, untamed power. Lightning curled and snapped around its form, wreathing it in a crown of storms. Its eyes burned, twin orbs of electric blue that seemed to pierce through everything, as if it could see not only Sarah but every secret she carried, every moment that had led her to this point. The sight was too much. Sarah's knees buckled beneath her, and she fell, hands sinking into the damp earth. Her heart pounded so violently that it felt as though it might burst from her chest. She couldn't look away, but every second under the Thunderbird's gaze was a battle against the instinct to flee. There was no hiding from it. Its presence filled the world, pushing against the edges of her mind until she thought she might shatter. It descended slowly, the wind from its wings tearing at the ground, uprooting stones and trees, sending waves rippling through the grass like an ocean in a storm. Every beat of its wings was a clap of thunder, every movement an eruption of power that left Sarah trembling. It wasn't just its size or its strength, it was the awe of it, the sense that this creature wasn't bound by the same rules of existence as anything else. It was more than alive. It was a force. When it landed, the ground shook. Its talons, sharp and jagged like ancient mountains, dug deep into the earth, carving out scars that would never heal. The air around it seemed to hum, vibrating with the energy of its presence. For a moment, it stood still, its head held high, its wings half extended, as if claiming the sky as its own. And then, slowly, it turned its gaze on Sarah. Her breath caught. Those eyes were not just fire and storm. They were ancient, heavy with knowledge and sorrow. They held the weight of countless battles fought, of victories that felt hollow, of losses that echoed through time. In them, Sarah saw the story of the world itself, its beauty, its chaos, its unending struggle to survive. She wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the words stuck in her throat. What could she possibly say to this creature, this being that had seen the rise and fall of civilizations, that had fought against forces too terrible to name? She was nothing compared to it. A speck of dust in the face of a storm. And yet, the Thunderbird's gaze softened, just barely. It tilted its massive head, the movement surprisingly gentle for something so vast. A low rumble came from its chest, a sound that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite thunder, but something in between. It felt like an acknowledgement, like it saw her, truly saw her, not as a rival, not as a threat, but as something worthy. The realization hit her like a lightning strike. She had been chosen. Out of all the people, all the paths that could have been taken, the Thunderbird had waited for her. It had watched, through the ages, for someone who could carry its purpose, its burden. And now, here she was. The air around her seemed to thrum with energy, a pulse that matched the rhythm of her racing heart. Slowly, almost without realizing it, Sarah rose to her feet. Her legs were weak, trembling beneath her, but she stood. The relic she had bonded with pulsed in her hands, its light flickering in sync with the lightning that danced across the Thunderbird's wings. It was as if they were connected, two halves of the same storm. The Thunderbird's head lowered slightly, bringing it closer to her. Its beak, sharp and gleaming, could have split her in two with a single movement, but it remained still. Its eyes searched hers, and for a moment, the storm around them seemed to pause. Time itself felt like it held its breath. And then, in a voice that wasn't a voice but a feeling that resonated in her very bones, it spoke. It wasn't words, exactly, but Sarah understood. She felt its sorrow, its anger, its desperation. It showed her flashes of its memories, moments of a world long gone, a time when the skies were clear, when the earth was whole, when balance had not yet been broken. And then, the battles. The darkness that had risen, the shadow that had consumed everything in its path. The Thunderbird had fought with all it had, but it had not been enough. It had sacrificed everything to seal the darkness away, knowing that it was only temporary, that one day the seal would break. And now, it was breaking. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, though she didn't remember when they had started. The Thunderbird's pain was her pain now, its burden hers to bear. She wanted to tell it she was sorry, that she understood, that she would do whatever it took to help. But before she could speak, the Thunderbird moved. Its wings spread wide, blotting out the sky, and with a single powerful beat, it lifted into the air. The wind it created knocked Sarah back, but she didn't fall this time. She stood firm, watching as it circled above her, its form glowing with an intensity that made her squint against the light. The storm clouds churned around it, and for a moment, it was as if the entire world had been swallowed by the storm. And then, with a crack of thunder so loud it felt like the earth itself might split, the Thunderbird let out a cry. It was a sound like no other, a sound that echoed across the mountains, the valleys, the rivers, and forests. It was a call to arms, a warning, a promise. It was power. Sarah stood in the center of it all, her hands gripping the relic tightly, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the Thunderbird's essence coursing through her, its strength and sorrow mingling with her own. She wasn't just a witness anymore. She was a part of this now, a part of the storm. And as the Thunderbird soared higher, its form fading into the swirling clouds, Sarah knew that the storm wasn't over. It was only beginning. The ground beneath her feet felt like it was shifting, trembling with an energy that wasn't quite of this world. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, each beat echoing like the rumble of thunder that still reverberated in the air. She stood at the edge of a precipice, a vast chasm before her, a deep, yawning abyss that stretched endlessly into the storm. The sky overhead was an unbroken canvas of swirling clouds, black and purple, crackling with the fury of 1,000 lightning strikes. In the center of it all, the Thunderbird watched her, its massive wings flaring wide as it hovered above the ground, the very embodiment of raw, untamed power. She didn't understand what she was supposed to do. How could she stand before something so ancient, so vast, and prove that she was worthy? The weight of the moment pressed down on her, suffocating, like the very air had thickened with expectation. The Thunderbird's eyes locked onto hers. The gaze was unwavering, intense, as if it could see into the very core of her being, laying bare every thought, every doubt, every fear. Sarah took a shaky breath, trying to steady her racing heart, but it felt impossible. The storm around her grew stronger, the winds howling in her ears, the ground shaking with the force of the Thunderbird's power. Then, in a voice that didn't speak but resonated deep within her, the Thunderbird called out, "Prove your worth." Sarah flinched. Her legs felt weak, and for a moment, she thought she might collapse. What could she possibly do to prove herself to a creature like this? What could she offer that would make her worthy of its power, its trust? The Thunderbird circled higher, its wings cutting through the air, sending gusts of wind tearing through the landscape. The storm followed its movements, swirling around it in a spiral of chaos and destruction. It was a force of nature, and Sarah felt as small as a single drop of rain in the midst of it all. The Thunderbird landed with a crash, its talons striking the earth with enough force to split the ground beneath it. The air crackled, the storm swirling even tighter. A test. A trial. Sarah could feel the weight of it all, the pressure building with every passing second. She thought of all the things she had done, all the people she had met, all the trials she had faced. Had they made her worthy? Or had she failed them, failed herself? The Thunderbird's voice came again, this time louder, clearer, more commanding. Your heart. Your soul. They must be pure. The storm intensified, as if the Thunderbird itself was challenging her, pushing her to the edge. Sarah clenched her fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms, but the pain was nothing compared to the fire building in her chest. The Thunderbird was testing her resolve, testing her very soul. It wasn't just about strength. It wasn't about power or skill. It was about the heart. A rush of memories hit her all at once. The faces of those she had met along the way, the kindness they had shown her, the pain they had suffered. She thought of the battles she had fought, the lives she had touched, both good and bad. The choices she had made had never been easy, but she had always tried to do what was right, what was just. Even when the world felt overwhelming, she had tried to hold on to her humanity, to her compassion, no matter how dark the storm had become. She thought of the Thunderbird's sorrow, the way its pain had resonated within her. This creature, this ancient force, wasn't just a beast of power, it was a guardian, a protector, bound to the earth by forces far greater than herself. It had fought, sacrificed, and endured through ages, and now it was asking her to prove that she could carry that burden, that she could hold on to the same values it had fought to protect. Sarah's hands tightened around the relic she had carried with her, the object now warm with an energy that seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. The storm surged around her, the winds howling, lightning cracking through the sky like a whip, but she didn't flinch. She stood her ground. "Show me your heart," the Thunderbird's voice commanded, low and rumbling, but there was something in it now, a trace of hope, as though it believed she could rise to the challenge. With a deep breath, Sarah stepped forward. The world seemed to tilt, the wind screaming as it tugged at her, pulling her in every direction. She could feel the Thunderbird watching her, its gaze both comforting and terrifying at the same time. She closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself, clearing her mind of everything but the storm, everything but the trial. She had fought so hard to be here, to reach this point. But none of it had been for glory, for fame, or for herself. It had all been for something greater. It had been for the earth, for the people she loved, for the balance of everything that lived. Her heart was not pure because she was perfect, it was pure because she had always tried to do right, even when the world seemed impossible, even when the odds were stacked against her. She raised her head, her eyes meeting the Thunderbird's once again. The storm raged around her, but inside, she was calm. Her heart beat steady, strong. The energy of the relic surged through her, filling her with warmth, but it was not the warmth of power, it was the warmth of conviction, of purpose. "I am ready," she whispered into the storm, her voice carrying over the winds. "I am here to protect what is good, to fight for balance, and to honor the earth and its creatures. My heart is yours." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The wind died down, the storm quieted, and the clouds parted just slightly, allowing a single ray of light to pierce through the darkness. Sarah stood, her eyes never leaving the Thunderbirds, as the massive creature stepped closer. The air was still, the sky holding its breath. And then, the Thunderbird lowered its head, its beak gently touching her forehead. A pulse of energy shot through her, not a blast of power, but a soft wave that filled her with warmth and understanding. It was the Thunderbird's acceptance, its acknowledgement of her heart, of her worth. The storm around them faded, the winds calming. And in that moment, Sarah knew she had passed the test. She had proven herself, not by strength, but by purity of heart and purpose. The Thunderbird had seen her, and it had deemed her worthy. The silence after the storm was suffocating. For a long moment, Sarah stood there, her heart pounding, not sure if the world around her was real or if she was still caught in some kind of dream. The Thunderbird loomed above her, its massive wings folded, its eyes glowing with an ancient, unyielding wisdom that seemed to see everything, every triumph, every failure, every pain. But what it saw, what it wanted to show her, was something entirely different. It wasn't about her. It wasn't about humanity. It wasn't about any of the petty struggles or hopes they held so dearly. The Thunderbird's purpose was something far greater, far older, than anything Sarah could have imagined. Her thoughts spiraled, her breath catching as the weight of the realization began to settle in. She had always believed that the Thunderbird was a protector, a being summoned to save humanity from the chaos and destruction of the world. It had been painted as a guardian, a symbol of power meant to bend the earth and the skies to the will of those who called on it. But now, standing face to face with this force of nature, she understood the truth. The Thunderbird was not a servant. It was not a tool for mankind's survival. It was a force of nature, a being forged by the earth itself, born not to protect humanity, but to maintain balance, to keep the natural world from collapsing in on itself. And in that truth, Sarah felt the ground beneath her shift once again. The earth was not just a place for people to live. It was a delicate ecosystem, a complex web of life that needed to be preserved, not ruled. The Thunderbird's wings stretched wide, and the sky around her darkened once more. A low rumble echoed from the heavens, a distant growl of thunder that made the hairs on the back of Sarah's neck stand on end. The air crackled with tension, but it wasn't fear, it was something far more profound, a hum of power that made the very earth seem to hold its breath. "You came," the Thunderbird's voice said, not aloud but within her, its words like a whisper against the wind. "You sought to understand me, but you did not know why you sought. It is not humanity I answer to. It is the balance of the world that I preserve." Sarah's knees nearly buckled beneath her. All the days of struggle, the pain of seeing people suffer, the hope that this legendary creature would bring an end to the chaos, all of it had been wrong. She had misunderstood the very nature of what they were facing. The world wasn't crumbling because of humanity alone. It wasn't just greed and war that tore it apart, it was the imbalance, the disruption of the earth itself. The Thunderbird's eyes glowed brighter now, a fierce light that seemed to pierce through Sarah's very soul. The storm that raged overhead swirled in chaotic patterns, but it wasn't just the wind or the lightning. It was the pulse of the natural world, a rhythm that was far older than the people who had walked its surface. The land, the sky, the sea, it all had a rhythm, a balance. The Thunderbird was not a creature of wrath or vengeance. It was a harbinger of balance. And when that balance was disturbed, when the forces of nature were out of sync, the Thunderbird was its enforcer. "You wish for answers," the Thunderbird continued, its voice soft, yet powerful. "But the answer is simple. I do not serve. I watch. I guide. I correct." Sarah's heart twisted in her chest. She thought of the battles she had fought, the lives that had been lost. She had believed that her cause was righteous, that the fight against the forces threatening humanity's future was worth it. But what if she had been fighting for something misguided? What if the true danger was not the human greed that sought to destroy, but the imbalance they had caused in the world? The Thunderbird's wings beat once, sending a gust of wind rushing through the valley. The storm swirled around them, swirling like an angry ocean, but there was an order to it. There was purpose. The Thunderbird's power, its very essence, was not meant to destroy, it was meant to correct. And when that correction came, it would be far beyond anything humanity could control or understand. The realization crashed over her like a wave. It wasn't that humanity was the enemy, it was that their presence on the earth had upset a delicate balance that needed to be restored. The Thunderbird wasn't an enemy. It wasn't a savior. It was a force of nature, a force that didn't care for human intentions or desires. Its only purpose was to preserve what was left of the Earth's natural state. "You seek a solution," the Thunderbird said, its voice taking on a more solemn tone. "But the solution is not for mankind alone. It is for all of existence. The Earth does not belong to you. It is a gift, and it is fragile. You, too, are fragile. And when the scales tip too far, when you push the balance too much, all will fall." Sarah's hands shook. She had known this truth deep down, somewhere in the back of her mind, but she hadn't wanted to face it. The world wasn't about saving humanity or conquering the forces that threatened them. It was about preserving balance. It was about respecting the natural world, respecting the forces that had shaped the earth long before humanity ever walked on it. The storm continued to rage, the winds howling, the sky cracking with the fury of the Thunderbird's power. But in the midst of it all, Sarah found herself strangely still. She had been so caught up in the idea of saving people, of fighting for justice and retribution. She had been blinded by the belief that humanity was the center of everything. But now, standing before the Thunderbird, she understood. The balance of the world mattered more than any individual cause, more than any one life. The natural world, and all its chaos and beauty, needed to be preserved, regardless of what humanity's desires might be. And in that realization, Sarah felt something shift inside her. It was like the weight of the world had been lifted from her shoulders, replaced by a quiet, humble understanding. The Thunderbird wasn't there to fight for her or for anyone else. It was there to make sure that when everything else crumbled, when the world teetered on the edge of destruction, balance would remain. She wasn't here to control the Thunderbird, to demand answers or solutions. She was here to listen. She was here to understand. The ground trembled beneath Sarah's feet, and the air was thick with a strange heaviness, like the very world itself was holding its breath. The sky above, once darkened by the storm's fury, split open in a flash of blinding light, and then came the sound, a low rumble that shook the heavens and rattled the bones of every living thing below. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't a storm. It was something far worse. A presence that made the earth itself recoil in fear. From the shadows, a dark shape slithered into view. A serpent, but not just any serpent. This one was massive, its body coiling and twisting with a dark, writhing energy that seemed to warp the air around it. Its eyes gleamed with malice, glowing with an unnatural light, as if they were two burning embers. The creature's skin shimmered with scales that reflected no light, only darkness, and as it slithered forward, the air grew colder, heavier. There was no sound to its movement, no hiss of breath, no scraping of scales. It was as though the serpent itself was made of the very darkness that had been threatening to swallow the world. And then, the Thunderbird emerged. The sky cracked again, this time with a thunderous roar that shook the heavens. The Thunderbird's wings stretched wide, a barrier of lightning and storm clouds swirling around its massive form. It was a creature of power, of grace, and of fury. The wind howled in response, and for a moment, Sarah thought the very mountains would crumble beneath the weight of the confrontation about to unfold. The serpent's eyes locked onto the Thunderbird, and the world seemed to pause. Two forces, ancient and powerful, were about to collide. One was a being of balance, of nature and the earth, a protector of the delicate harmony that had once existed. The other was a manifestation of destruction, a force that sought to unravel that balance, to corrupt and consume. For a moment, Sarah stood frozen, unable to look away. The storm raged around them, the sky flashing with bolts of lightning, thunder crashing in every direction. The earth trembled, as if it, too, feared what was coming. She could feel the tension between the two beings, a palpable force that hung heavy in the air, pressing down on her chest. And then, the clash began. The serpent struck first, its massive form coiling and lunging toward the Thunderbird with the speed of a predator. Its jaws, dripping with venom, snapped open, aiming to sink its fangs into the Thunderbird's powerful form. But the Thunderbird was ready. With a flap of its wings, the air itself seemed to explode in a blast of thunder, knocking the serpent back. The force of the blow sent shockwaves through the sky, and the ground below cracked, fissures spreading like veins of lightning across the earth. The serpent hissed in fury, its tail slamming into the ground, sending a shockwave that cracked the earth beneath it. The air shimmered with the dark energy emanating from it, and the world around them seemed to twist and warp as if reality itself was being pulled into the serpent's grasp. The serpent's coils unwound, and it lunged again, its body a blur of dark scales and venomous fury. But the Thunderbird was faster. With a beat of its wings, the Thunderbird launched itself into the air, its body crackling with raw energy. Lightning arced from its wings, striking the serpent with a force that made the heavens themselves scream in pain. The serpent recoiled, its body writhing, its scales burning from the intense heat. But it was relentless. It lashed out again, its body a black streak of fury and darkness, seeking to crush the Thunderbird beneath its power. For a moment, Sarah thought the world might shatter from the sheer force of the battle. The air crackled with energy, each clash of the two titans sending ripples through the very fabric of the world. The storm raged harder, the wind howling with an intensity that seemed to echo the anger and pain of both creatures. The sky split open with every strike, and the earth trembled beneath the violence of their struggle. And then, a sickening sound. The serpent's massive tail struck the Thunderbird, sending it spiraling toward the ground. For a moment, Sarah's heart stopped as she watched the majestic creature plummet toward the earth. It was as if time had frozen, and for that brief instant, the sky itself seemed to hold its breath. The Thunderbird's wings flared out at the last moment, catching the wind just in time to slow its descent, but it still crashed to the earth with a force that sent a shockwave through the landscape. The serpent loomed above, its eyes gleaming with a triumph that made Sarah's blood run cold. It had the Thunderbird on the ground, its massive body coiling around the fallen creature, its venomous fangs poised to strike. The world held its breath, the storm swirling around them like a living thing, its fury now focused on the two mighty beings locked in combat. But the Thunderbird was not finished. With a deafening screech, the Thunderbird unfurled its wings, releasing a blast of energy so powerful that the very sky seemed to crack open. The serpent recoiled, its body uncoiling in a flash of darkness. The thunder that followed the explosion was deafening, a roar that seemed to shake the heavens themselves. The serpent hissed in fury, its body writhing, but the Thunderbird was already in the air, its wings crackling with raw, uncontained power. The serpent lunged again, but this time, the Thunderbird was ready. With a twist of its massive wings, the air around it exploded in a surge of lightning, and the serpent was struck down, its body writhing in agony as the raw energy scorched its dark scales. For a moment, the serpent seemed to falter, its massive form flickering in and out of existence, as if it were being torn apart by the sheer force of the Thunderbird's power. But still, it did not give up. The battle raged on, each clash of the two titans sending shockwaves through the earth, tearing at the fabric of reality itself. The storm, once fierce and wild, now seemed to have a life of its own, swirling around the two combatants, a reflection of the chaos and violence unfolding above. The skies cracked open, the earth shattered beneath the force of their battle, and all Sarah could do was watch in awe and terror as the world itself seemed to tremble at the power of these ancient beings locked in a struggle for dominance. It was a clash that would decide the fate of the earth itself, a battle that would either restore balance or tear everything apart. The wind howled around Sarah as she stood at the edge of the battlefield, the storm raging with a fury that matched the conflict unfolding before her. The Thunderbird, powerful and proud, battled against the serpent, its wings crackling with lightning. Each strike of its beak sent shockwaves through the sky, and the earth itself trembled beneath the weight of their struggle. It was a battle that could tip the scales between life and destruction, and Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, caught between fear and a fierce desire to help. The ground beneath her shook again, sending ripples of dust into the air. Her gaze flickered toward the Thunderbird, watching as it faltered for a moment, its great wings beaten by the serpent's relentless strikes. She could see the weariness in its movements, the sheer exhaustion of the fight. The serpent's venomous body lashed out again, sending the Thunderbird spiraling toward the earth with a cry of pain that echoed through the heavens. For a split second, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The Thunderbird was losing. The weight of the battle was too much for it to bear alone. And in that moment, Sarah's heart weighed heavy with the knowledge that the world, her world, hung in the balance. Her hands clenched at her sides, and a voice deep inside her whispered, "You have to do something. You have to help." It was a call that rang through her very being, a cry that demanded action. The Thunderbird was not just an ancient force of nature, it was the protector, the one who held the fragile balance of life. If it fell, the earth would be consumed by the serpent's darkness. She couldn't let that happen. But then, another voice, quieter yet just as insistent, spoke from within her. What if helping means risking everything? What if the path you choose changes everything? Sarah glanced down at the ground, her eyes catching the faint glint of an object half buried in the dirt. It was an old, worn relic, one she had seen before, an object tied to the Thunderbird, something that could aid in restoring balance, perhaps even bring the Thunderbird back to its full strength. But the more she thought about it, the more she understood the weight of the decision she faced. The Thunderbird needed help, desperately. But how far would helping it take her? Could it be the right choice, or would it lead her down a path she could never return from? The energy of the storm seemed to press in around her. The sky above churned with thunder, and lightning crackled through the air with an intensity that threatened to swallow everything in its wake. The serpent, sensing its advantage, reared back for another strike, its massive form coiling, its dark eyes fixed on the struggling Thunderbird. With each moment that passed, Sarah felt the sense of urgency growing, the world around her urging her to act. Her hands shook, the weight of the decision pressing down on her like a stone. She could feel the pull toward the Thunderbird, the call of its power, its desperate need for help. I can't just stand here, she thought, her heart thudding loudly in her chest. The storm, the earth, the very sky itself seemed to be alive with the roar of the battle, each crack of thunder like a pounding heartbeat. But then, the moment of clarity came. It wasn't just about the Thunderbird. It wasn't just about the serpent. It was about balance, about everything that had ever existed, about everything that had been lost and everything that could still be saved. The Thunderbird wasn't just a creature of power. It was a force of nature, a guardian of life itself. If she chose to help it, she could risk not just her life, but the lives of everyone around her. Yet, if she chose not to act, the earth would be consumed, and all would be lost. Sarah's thoughts raced. The object, there was a way to use it. But that meant stepping into the heart of the storm, risking everything. To call on the Thunderbird's power, to tap into the force of nature itself, was no small task. It was dangerous. It could destroy her. But if she didn't, the serpent would win. The balance would be lost. For the briefest of moments, Sarah allowed herself to think of all the people she had known, all the lives that would be lost if she did nothing. Her mind flashed to her village, the faces of those who had trusted her, the hope they had placed in her. Was it worth it to risk all that, to gamble everything on a chance? Was it worth it to sacrifice herself for a greater cause? A tremor ran through her body, and she realized, in that instant, that the answer was already clear. It had always been clear. It wasn't about her anymore. It wasn't about the serpent, or the Thunderbird, or the storm that raged around them. It was about something far bigger, about the earth, the balance of all things, and the chance to make a difference when the world needed it the most. Without another thought, Sarah stepped forward. Her heart raced as she moved toward the relic, her fingers brushing the surface of it. The moment she touched it, a surge of energy shot through her, overwhelming her senses. It was as though the very soul of the Thunderbird had reached out to her, calling her to action. She could feel its power, its sadness, its hope, and something more, an understanding, a connection that bound them together in that single, decisive moment. The storm raged louder, the sky seeming to twist in agony as the Thunderbird cried out again, its voice a thunderous roar that vibrated through her chest. She felt the weight of the creature's suffering, its struggle, and for the first time, she understood, this was not just a fight for survival. It was a fight for balance, for harmony, for everything that was connected to the earth and the sky. Sarah closed her eyes, her heart steadying as she made her choice. She was not just fighting for the Thunderbird. She was fighting for everything. With all the strength she had left, she raised the relic high, calling upon the power of the Thunderbird, allowing the energy to surge through her. And as the light erupted from her, a single thought filled her mind, clear and undeniable: this is the moment that will change everything. The storm howled, and the earth trembled. The choice had been made. Now, there was no turning back. The storm raged, but for just a moment, the world fell silent. The air, thick with the weight of the battle, seemed to hold its breath. It was as though the universe itself had paused, suspended in a heartbeat. The thunder, once deafening, now seemed a distant echo. The sky, once split by the fury of lightning, hung still, as if afraid to move. The winds, howling just moments before, fell to a whisper. There, in the eye of the storm, everything changed. Sarah stood in the center of it, her heart racing as if it, too, had paused. The violent forces of nature that had torn at the world just moments ago were now still, leaving only the hum of tension in the air. She felt it, a moment of peace amidst the chaos, but not one that brought comfort. It was a silence filled with questions, with truths waiting to be revealed. And she wasn't sure she was ready for them. Her eyes flickered between the Thunderbird and the serpent, both now frozen in place, locked in a standoff that was almost too surreal to comprehend. The Thunderbird, its immense form still crackling with power, seemed to stand at the edge of collapse. It was injured, weary, its once mighty wings now drooping. The serpent, coiled and ready to strike, was no better. Its scales glistened, slick with venom, but its movements slowed, as though it too were waiting for something to shift. In the stillness, Sarah's thoughts whirled. The weight of everything she had faced, everything she had fought for, pressed on her chest like a stone. She had made her choice, had done what she thought was right, but now, in this eye of the storm, she was unsure. Had it been enough? Had she truly understood the stakes, or was she simply grasping at a hope that was too fragile to survive? A soft breeze touched her skin, and for the first time, she noticed how the air had changed. It felt heavier now, laden with truth and uncertainty. She glanced to the side, and there, standing just beyond the reach of the Thunderbird, was the relic she had raised moments before. Its power, now settled into her hands, thrummed faintly, but there was something more to it now, something she couldn't yet understand. The air shifted again, this time with a hum of something ancient. She could feel it in her bones, the subtle pulse of an energy far older than anything she had known. It was as though the very earth, the very sky, was speaking to her. But it wasn't just the natural world, it was the Thunderbird itself, its voice resonating through her, not in words, but in feelings, in understanding. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, and the flood of realization hit her like a wave. The Thunderbird was not merely a protector, not simply a force of power. It was a keeper, a guardian of balance, of harmony between all things, human and nature, life and death. It was not here to serve humanity, not here to protect them from their own mistakes. It existed to maintain equilibrium. It had been fighting for that balance, for the preservation of the world itself. And now, as the storm paused, the stakes became clear. Sarah opened her eyes and saw it, the truth, staring back at her through the very eyes of the Thunderbird. She understood now that the serpent, the darkness, was not just an enemy to be defeated. It was part of the balance too. Without it, the world would fall into chaos, as much as it would if the Thunderbird were to fall. There was no simple victory. There was no easy solution. The balance was delicate, fragile, and any choice she made could tip the scales forever. Her breath caught as a sudden rush of cold air swept through the clearing, the calm moment slipping away like sand through her fingers. The winds picked up once more, and with them, the weight of responsibility. She had chosen to act, to risk everything, but now the full weight of her decision pressed against her chest. She could feel the presence of something greater than herself, something she had never truly understood until now. Her hands trembled, still holding the relic, and she felt the presence of the Thunderbird again. It wasn't just a connection. It was a bond. She wasn't just a witness to this battle, she was part of it. The Thunderbird's essence had merged with hers, had become a part of her very soul. The storm had given her strength, but it had also given her insight into the world's delicate threads, the balance between light and dark, the fragile line that held everything together. A voice, calm yet filled with the weight of ages, seemed to speak directly to her. Not in words, but in understanding. You see it now, don't you? This fight is not yours to win. It is a test of what you will choose. Balance or destruction. Harmony or chaos. You are but one thread in a much greater weave. The serpent's coils shifted, the battle not yet over, but Sarah knew that the storm was not just a physical manifestation. It was a test. The calm was a moment of reckoning, the eye of the storm not just a pause in the chaos, but an invitation to make a choice. The sky, the earth, the storm, it all waited for her decision. What would she do? The serpent's darkness, the Thunderbird's light, how could she reconcile them? How could she make a choice that would save the world without condemning it? She closed her eyes again, not to shut out the world, but to listen. To listen to the beating of her own heart, to the pulse of the earth beneath her feet, to the whispers of the storm in the sky. In this brief, suspended moment, everything was laid bare before her. It was no longer a question of victory or defeat. It was about understanding, about recognizing that nothing was ever truly as simple as it seemed. The battle would not be won by strength alone. It would not be won by a single choice or by a single being. It would be won by understanding the nature of the world, by understanding the delicate balance that held everything in place. The eye of the storm was over, but the truth had been revealed. The world would not be saved by force, but by wisdom. By choosing balance over destruction. By understanding that to preserve life, sometimes, you must allow for both light and shadow to exist. The winds picked up again, and the world shifted back into chaos. But Sarah knew now that she was ready. Ready to make the choice. Ready to play her part in the storm. The sky was heavy with the scent of rain, the air thick with the raw power of a world on the brink of something vast, something final. The Thunderbird, towering above the earth, its wings flickering with the remnants of a storm, trembled. Its power was fading, its immense energy dwindling, as if the weight of the battle had drained the life out of it. Sarah could feel the change in the air, the last moments of a legend, teetering on the edge of survival. It was hard to breathe with the weight of everything pressing in. The group stood around the Thunderbird, facing what might be their final chance to save it, to save the world. They could feel it. The earth, the air, the water, all of them were watching, waiting. The Thunderbird was more than just a creature, it was the beating heart of the storm itself, the balance of life and death, light and shadow. Without it, the world would fall into chaos, its fragile harmony unraveling at the seams. But it wasn't just the Thunderbird that needed saving. The group had come this far together, each of them carrying their own burdens, their own struggles, but now, in this moment, their strength had to merge. They had no other choice. The elemental spirits, the guardians of the earth, had to be called upon, their power harnessed to heal what had been broken. Sarah stood at the front, feeling the familiar weight of the relic in her hands. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the cool breeze brush across her face. There was a connection here, between her, the Thunderbird, and the spirits of the earth. She didn't fully understand it yet, but she could feel it thrumming through her veins, an ancient power just beyond the edge of her perception. It was as if the world itself had whispered a message to her, it's time. Time to bring together the forces of nature and the strength of the human spirit. Slowly, she stepped forward, the others following. Each of them had their role to play. Jaren, with his quiet strength, stepped beside her, his eyes determined, his hands raised toward the heavens, ready to call upon the wind. Tessa, with her deep understanding of the earth, knelt down, her hands pressed against the soil, asking the ground itself to lend its power. And then there was Rael, whose connection to the waters ran deeper than anyone could have imagined. His hands glowed with a faint blue light as he whispered a prayer to the rivers and oceans, to the rain that had once drenched the land. Together, they raised their arms toward the sky, and Sarah felt the power of the spirits responding, the world around them coming alive with energy. The wind stirred, a low rumble of thunder building in the distance, and the earth beneath their feet trembled. The sky above them darkened, but it wasn't a storm, it was a promise. The Thunderbird's wings fluttered, once, twice, and then it shuddered, as if awakening from a long, exhausted sleep. The spirits of the elements were with them, surrounding them, pushing them forward. Each breath Sarah took was filled with the power of the earth, of the water, of the fire, of the wind. The spirits had not abandoned them, not yet. The Thunderbird wasn't alone in its struggle. Not anymore. A flash of brilliant light lit up the sky, and Sarah felt it, a surge of raw, unfiltered power. The Thunderbird's eyes opened, glowing with the same light, and it let out a cry that echoed through the very heavens. The ground beneath them trembled, and for a moment, Sarah felt as if the world itself was being torn apart. But it was a good kind of destruction, the kind that came with rebirth, with healing, with the restoration of balance. She reached out, her hand trembling as it hovered over the Thunderbird's chest. The power she felt flowing through her was overwhelming, and yet, somehow, it felt right. The relic in her hands pulsed in rhythm with the Thunderbird's heart, and she understood then. It wasn't just about saving the Thunderbird, it was about restoring the balance. This was the final flight, the moment where the world would either be torn apart or set free. The energy built and built, the air crackling with the raw force of nature itself. The winds began to swirl around them, the earth beneath their feet shifting, as if awakening from a long, deep slumber. The spirits of fire, water, air, and earth all gathered together, their powers converging in a single point of unimaginable force. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for the final moment, the final call. Sarah could feel the pressure in her chest, the need to push forward, to let go of everything she had ever known, and to let the elements guide her. It was terrifying, yet exhilarating. The spirits, the Thunderbird, the relic, all of it had led to this moment, this point of connection between human and nature. She could no longer tell where she ended and the Thunderbird began. Their hearts beat as one. The wind howled, the earth groaned, and the heavens themselves seemed to split apart. The energy built to a deafening crescendo, and then, a silence. A stillness that rang in the air like a bell. The moment of reckoning had come. Sarah opened her eyes and saw it, the Thunderbird, fully restored, its wings stretched wide, powerful and free once more. Its eyes shone with a brilliance that seemed to pierce through the storm, through time itself. It was no longer just a symbol of power. It was the embodiment of the Earth's will, of the spirit of balance, of the connection between all things. The group stood in awe, feeling the weight of what had just happened. They had done it. They had brought the Thunderbird back to life, not by force, but by understanding, by uniting the forces of nature and the strength of their own hearts. The final flight had begun. The Thunderbird soared into the sky, its wings cutting through the clouds, leaving behind a trail of light, a beacon of hope and renewal. The storm that had once threatened to consume everything was now a distant memory, and in its place, the world stood still, peaceful, balanced, whole. For the first time, Sarah allowed herself to breathe deeply, the weight of the past lifting from her shoulders. The storm had passed, but in its wake, something far greater had been born. The Thunderbird had risen, and with it, the promise of a world that would never forget the price of balance. The sky darkened with a sense of dread, a heaviness settling over the land like the weight of 1,000 storms. The Thunderbird, mighty and awakened, soared high above, its wings sweeping through the air, casting shadows across the earth. Its eyes blazed with an ancient power, but even as it stretched its wings to the heavens, something more sinister stirred beneath the surface. A deep, unnatural quiet hung in the air, thickening with every passing moment. The world seemed to hold its breath. Far below, on the ground, Sarah's heart raced as she felt it, the pulse of something dark, something that wasn't meant to be. The earth beneath her feet trembled, not with the usual rumblings of nature, but with the harsh, unforgiving presence of something malevolent, something designed to tear the very fabric of balance asunder. The clouds above began to twist in on themselves, darkening into a black mass that seemed to stretch across the sky like a living entity. The wind, once a gentle breeze from the Thunderbird's wings, now turned cold, sharp, and full of malice. Sarah looked up, her stomach twisting in fear as she saw the storm, no longer a natural force, but a violent, chaotic tempest, teeming with the darkest of powers. The dark serpent, its coils twisted in the clouds, had risen at last. Its eyes glowed red, burning with an unholy fire. It was no longer a mere shadow in the distance, it was here. And it was angry. The air crackled with energy, thick with an ominous charge. The Thunderbird's wings faltered for a moment, as if feeling the weight of the storm closing in around it. It let out a cry, a battle cry, and it was both beautiful and terrifying, echoing across the land. But the darkness didn't retreat. It advanced. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized the terrifying truth. The serpent's dark forces were coming. The world itself was being swallowed by the storm, the sky darkening with each passing second. And in that moment, Sarah knew the Thunderbird, no matter how powerful, could not face this alone. The ground beneath her feet shifted once again, this time with a more violent tremor as the storm began to take form. The dark clouds twisted into a shape, something unnatural and twisted, forming into shapes that moved like shadows across the land. Figures emerged from the cloud, flickering in and out of sight, cloaked in darkness. They were the Stormbreakers, creatures born from the heart of the dark serpent's malevolent power. Their eyes gleamed with hunger, their forms indistinct but terrifying, as if made of pure shadow and fury. Sarah felt a chill creep down her spine as one of the figures moved closer. Its eyes locked on hers, and in that moment, she understood. These creatures weren't just physical beings, They were part of the storm itself, born to shatter and destroy everything in their path. They were the embodiment of chaos, of destruction, of the storm's wrath unleashed. The wind howled, the ground shook beneath her, and the Thunderbird, even in its massive glory, seemed to falter for just a moment. Sarah's mind raced, her heart thundering in her chest. She had to act, but how? How could they possibly stand against such a force? And then it hit her. It wasn't just the Thunderbird that could stand against the storm, it was the unity of everything. The elements, the earth, the people, the very spirits that had once guided them. They had to fight together, not just with power, but with purpose. The balance wasn't just about strength, it was about the will to survive, to protect, to fight for everything that mattered. The Thunderbird had never been alone. It had always been part of something bigger. Rail, she whispered, and the sound of his name carried a weight of its own. The water had always been his ally, but it was more than just water, it was life itself. She turned to Jaren, whose connection to the winds was unmatched, and Tessa, who understood the earth in ways no one else could. They had been through so much, and now, standing together, they were stronger than ever. The Stormbreaker forces surged forward, their forms growing larger, more solid, with every step. Their power was overwhelming, relentless, and yet, in the depths of Sarah's soul, she felt something else stirring. It wasn't just fear, it was determination. The storm could break, but only if they stood united. Sarah's voice broke through the cacophony of the wind. We need to work together. Now. Jaren raised his arms, calling upon the winds, and the sky responded with a roar. The air around them surged, twisting into a vortex of energy that pushed against the darkness. Tessa pressed her hands to the ground, summoning the strength of the earth, the soil beneath her vibrating with power. And Rael, his eyes alight with an ancient fire, called upon the waters, bringing forth a surge that crashed against the serpent's storm. The storm howled, the winds whipping against them with an unrelenting force. The dark figures moved closer, their eyes glowing brighter, the storm growing fiercer. It was a battle, not of individual power, but of wills, of the strength of the world against the darkness that sought to consume it. The Thunderbird's wings beat once more, a flash of lightning igniting the sky, its power filling the air with an electric charge. The battle was far from over, but the tide had turned. The storm was no longer something beyond their control, it was something they could fight. Together. But as the Thunderbird's wings unfurled, massive and strong, Sarah felt the weight of the world resting on her shoulders. They were up against the forces of destruction itself. How could they win? And yet, with each beat of the Thunderbird's wings, with each surge of power from the spirits of the earth, water, and air, Sarah knew there was always a way to fight. Even against the darkest storm. Even against the Stormbreaker that threatened to tear it all apart. As the battle raged on, the sound of the storm's fury growing louder, she held onto the one thing that was stronger than anything else in the world, hope. And with that hope, the storm had to break. The sky exploded into blinding light, the heavens themselves torn apart by the fury of the storm. The Thunderbird, massive and wild, fought against the dark serpent's thrashing coils, its wings crackling with raw energy. But no matter how powerful its cry, no matter how fierce its charge, it wasn't enough. The serpent's darkness seemed endless, a void that devoured everything in its path. And then, in the midst of the chaos, a whisper. It was barely a sound, more like a pulse, a heartbeat that resonated deep within Sarah. Her heart skipped. She couldn't ignore it. It felt like the air around her was charged with an invisible force, calling to her, urging her to step forward. The storm raged on, but within that storm, there was something else, something softer, like a thread of light waiting to be pulled. Her fingers trembled as she reached out instinctively, connecting with that thread. The world seemed to pause. For a heartbeat, a breath, she felt the pull of something ancient, something untouchable, and yet so close. It was the Thunderbird, its spirit, its very essence, waiting. She could feel it, its sadness, its strength, its hunger to fight, to protect the world that was its charge. The connection surged through her like a jolt of lightning. For a moment, she was terrified. Was this what she had been preparing for? Was she strong enough to carry this burden, to take on a force as wild, as untamed as the Thunderbird itself? She could hear its voice in her mind, not words, but a feeling, a call to action. And then she understood. The Thunderbird was not just a force of nature, it was the embodiment of the balance between all things. A part of it existed in everything, in every heartbeat, every drop of rain, every gust of wind. And now, it was asking her to become a part of it, to fight with it, to merge their strength together against the serpent's darkness. She stood still, feeling the storm swirl around her, the wind screaming, the thunder cracking. But within that chaos, she found a stillness, an absolute calm that filled her heart. A spark. A connection that could not be denied. The Thunderbird's power surged through her, its energy an unstoppable tide. She was no longer just a person. She was a part of the storm. She was the storm. The world around her seemed to stretch out, the tempest at her back, as though the very air itself had bowed to the force she now wielded. Her body hummed with energy, each breath like a surge of power. And then, the Thunderbird's massive form descended from the sky, its wings beating so hard the air trembled. It landed beside her with a mighty roar, the ground shaking beneath its weight. The earth seemed to bow in reverence, the winds howling in joy. Sarah could feel it, the pulse of the creature that had once only existed in myth. Now, it was real. And it was hers, and she was its. The Thunderbird lowered its head, its glowing eyes locking with hers. In that moment, everything else disappeared, the battle, the storm, the darkness. It was just her, standing there in the heart of the storm, as the power of the Thunderbird filled her. The connection was complete. She was no longer just Sarah. She was the storm itself, a force of nature, and together, they would face the serpent. The ground beneath her feet cracked, the air buzzing with the intensity of the energy building up around her. The storm grew louder, but it wasn't a sound of fear. It was the roar of strength. The winds whipped around them, but they moved with purpose now, like soldiers on the march. The world was waking up, breathing again. The dark serpent had no idea what it was about to face. She raised her hands, the sky answering with a surge of energy, the clouds flashing with lightning. The Thunderbird's power surged through her, its essence joining with hers. Together, they were unstoppable. The storm answered her call. The earth beneath her trembled in response. The winds howled louder than before. And in that moment, she felt what it was like to be one with the world itself. Her heart raced as she felt the storm's power course through her. She could feel the Thunderbird's energy now, the pulse of its spirit beating in rhythm with hers. There was no fear. There was no hesitation. There was only the undeniable force of nature. The dark serpent stirred. Its coils unfurled, seeking to strike. But now, it was different. The air crackled with energy, and the ground trembled beneath its force. It wasn't just the Thunderbird alone. It was Sarah, too. The storm swirled in a cyclone of power, and she felt the energy of the earth, the water, the air, the fire, the very elements themselves, converge within her. The Thunderbird roared beside her, a sound that was both primal and pure, as if calling on the heavens themselves. The serpent's darkness crept closer, its mouth opening in a terrible snarl. The storm cracked, the sky splitting open as if it, too, was torn between two worlds. But Sarah was no longer afraid. She was the storm, and together with the Thunderbird, they could end this. A bolt of lightning shot from the sky, crashing down, a strike of pure energy. It hit the serpent, but the darkness twisted around it, protecting itself. The storm raged, but the serpent's power pushed back with a force of its own. For a moment, everything was still. And then, Sarah closed her eyes, took a breath, and let the Thunderbird's power flow through her completely. She was ready. Her arms raised to the sky once more, and with it came the Thunderbird's roar. The energy around them swirled, gathered into one singular force, a thunderous cry that ripped through the storm. The serpent recoiled, its dark form shaking with the power now gathering against it. The storm had come for it. And it would not go unanswered. Sarah's voice was no longer just hers. It was the thunder itself, a force too great to contain. The storm broke free, and with the Thunderbird's power now fully hers, the world seemed to light up with the energy of 1,000 storms. The darkness recoiled, but it was no match for the storm that had been unleashed. And in that moment, she knew, together, they would break the serpent's hold. Together, they would save the world. The storm howled, a wild and chaotic symphony of wind, rain, and thunder. The world around them was consumed by the relentless fury of the battle. Above, the Thunderbird fought, its wings tearing through the sky with a power that sent shockwaves through the air. Below, the serpent twisted and struck, its dark coils seeking to crush all that stood in its path. The very earth seemed to shake beneath their feet. Sarah stood there, heart racing, caught between the forces of nature at war. She could feel the intensity of the battle all around her, the raw power of the Thunderbird surging through her veins, a fire burning within her. But she also felt the weight of what they were facing. They were losing. The serpent's darkness was too great, its power too overwhelming. Even the storm, no matter how fierce, couldn't seem to break its hold. And then, from behind her, a voice broke through the chaos. "We can still win," said Yarrick. His voice was steady, calm despite the madness swirling around them. "But it's going to take more than just power." Sarah turned to face him, her breath catching. Yarrick was standing there, his expression determined, but there was something in his eyes that she couldn't quite place. He was looking at her as though he knew something she didn't. Something she wasn't ready to hear. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice shaking. Yarrick's eyes met hers, and for a moment, everything else faded. The winds, the storm, the serpent, they all seemed to disappear, leaving only the two of them standing there, alone in a moment that felt like an eternity. "It's not enough," he said quietly. "Not just the Thunderbird, not just the storm. We need balance. And that balance requires a sacrifice." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning, and Sarah felt her heart drop. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "There has to be another way. We can't." But Yarrick's gaze never wavered. "I've seen it, Sarah. I know what's coming. The balance, it won't tip unless one of us steps forward." Her breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe what he was saying. She didn't want to believe it. "I'm the one," Yarrick said, his voice firm now, though it was filled with a sadness that tugged at her soul. "It's me. I've known for a while." "No," Sarah said, stepping forward, panic rising in her chest. "No, Yarrick. You can't. You don't have to do this. We can find another way." But Yarrick shook his head, a faint smile crossing his lips. It was the smile of someone who had already made peace with the decision they knew they had to make. "It's the only way," he said softly. "If I don't, if none of us do, everything we've fought for, everything the Thunderbird stands for, it'll be lost. The storm, the serpent, it's all part of something bigger. I can't let that happen. You're the future, Sarah. You have to be." The wind howled around them, as though the very sky understood what was happening. It felt as if the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Yarrick stepped forward, his hand reaching for her, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "I've known from the moment I joined you that this was always the way it would be. I was meant to help you get here. To give you a chance. But this battle, it's too much for any one person to win. It's too much for just the Thunderbird. But if I can give myself, if I can tip the scales in its favor, then maybe, just maybe, we can save this world." The words hit her like a wave, crashing over her. She wanted to scream, to fight against what he was saying, but she couldn't. She knew, deep down, that there was no other way. The serpent's dark form loomed in the distance, its hiss cutting through the storm, a reminder of what they were fighting against. The Thunderbird cried out, its wings beating against the wind, but even its power seemed to falter, struggling against the serpent's relentless force. Yarrick turned back toward the battle, his expression hardening. "It's the only way. Trust me." Tears blurred Sarah's vision. She didn't want to lose him. She couldn't. He had been with her from the beginning, supporting her, believing in her when no one else did. How could she lose him now? But she saw the certainty in his eyes. She saw the peace that had settled in his heart, the acceptance that this was his purpose, his role to play in this moment. "I won't let you die, Yarrick," Sarah said, her voice breaking. Yarrick smiled, a sad but resolute smile. "You don't have a choice. None of us do." With a final glance, Yarrick stepped away from her, moving toward the heart of the storm. The Thunderbird's cry rang out again, this time joined by Yarrick's voice, strong and steady, as he called out to the elemental spirits, asking for the strength he needed to tip the scales. Sarah stood frozen, her heart aching, as Yarrick reached the center of the storm. The Thunderbird's massive form circled above him, the wind swirling with increasing intensity. And then, as if the storm itself had heard his plea, lightning struck the ground with a deafening crack. Sarah gasped, her hands reaching out, but it was too late. Yarrick's body was surrounded by the crackling energy, his form glowing with the power of the storm. A single, final cry escaped him, a sound that was both triumphant and filled with sorrow. And then, in an instant, he was gone. The storm seemed to pause. For a breath, for a moment, everything was still. The wind ceased, the thunder stopped, and the skies cleared. And in that silence, Sarah understood. Yarrick had given everything to protect them, to protect the world. His sacrifice was the tipping point they needed, the final force that would shift the balance in favor of the Thunderbird. Tears streamed down her face as she stood there, the weight of his loss pressing down on her. She had lost him, but in doing so, she had gained something greater than she could ever have imagined. The storm was still there, still raging, but now there was a shift. A change. The balance had been restored. And Yarrick's sacrifice had made it possible. The world held its breath. A heavy, unnerving silence followed the storm's howl, as if the earth itself had paused in anticipation. The thunderstorm that had raged for hours now felt like a mere prelude, a warning to what was coming next. The air was thick, charged, as though every drop of rain carried a weight of centuries, an ancient power waiting to be unleashed. Above, the Thunderbird hovered, its wings spread wide, more magnificent than ever before. The storm was its canvas, the sky its stage. It circled, its eyes aflame with purpose, a force of nature that was now fully awake. The time had come for the world to feel its wrath. Sarah stood, her heart pounding in her chest, feeling the crackling energy in the air like a storm about to burst. She had seen it, the sacrifice, the pain, the power building inside the Thunderbird. It wasn't just an animal. It was something far older, far stronger, more ancient than anything she could ever have imagined. The force of nature, of destruction, was now in its full form, ready to strike. The serpent, coiling and thrashing in the distance, had grown stronger, its dark power twisted with every breath it took. It slithered, its scales glistening with malice, its eyes gleaming with hunger. It had come to devour everything, to end what the Thunderbird had fought to protect. The balance was tipping dangerously close to disaster, and yet, in this moment, Sarah felt something else, something new, something wild and powerful, growing inside of her too. She had felt Yarrick's loss deeply. But with it, there was a new fire, a sense of responsibility that she could not ignore. The Thunderbird wasn't fighting alone. It had always had help, from every element of nature, from every spirit, from every heart that believed in it. Now, that belief pulsed in Sarah's veins. The ground beneath them trembled as the serpent hissed, its darkness lashing out in every direction. The battle was far from over. But then the Thunderbird's cry pierced the air, sharp and unyielding, a call that rattled the heavens themselves. The storm that had been brewing for hours seemed to snap into focus. The clouds darkened, swirling faster now, twisting and pulling with an intensity that made the world seem like it was on the edge of collapse. And then, the first bolt of lightning cracked through the sky, the thunder shaking the heavens. It was so loud, so violent, it felt like the world itself was screaming. The Thunderbird's eyes blazed with fury. It was no longer just an animal, no longer just a creature of legend. It was a force of nature, pure and untamed. And it was angry. With one massive, powerful beat of its wings, the Thunderbird sent a shockwave through the sky. The winds howled, carrying with them the fury of the storm as they slammed into the serpent. The air itself seemed to crack and bend as the two forces collided in the sky. The serpent writhed in agony as the storm bore down upon it, the Thunderbird's power smashing into it like a wall of unstoppable force. Sarah stood, watching in awe and terror as the Thunderbird's full power was unleashed. She could feel the heat of it on her skin, the fury in the air. The storm raged like a living thing, each lightning strike a stroke of wrath, each thunderclap a deafening roar of destruction. The serpent screamed, its body writhing, but it couldn't escape. It was being torn apart, piece by piece, by the storm's fury. But the Thunderbird wasn't finished. Not yet. With a roar that shook the earth itself, the Thunderbird dived, wings stretched wide, plunging straight into the heart of the storm. The heavens seemed to crack open as it descended, an explosion of light and sound. The serpent, its black eyes wide with shock and fear, tried to strike back, its dark form flailing as it struggled to avoid the oncoming wrath. And then, with a sound like the sky itself was splitting in two, the Thunderbird unleashed its final blow. A bolt of lightning, so powerful and pure, slammed into the serpent, the crack of thunder deafening in its wake. The serpent's form seemed to disintegrate under the force, its dark energy writhing, collapsing in on itself as the storm's might overwhelmed it. The sky turned white with the intensity of the blast, and for a moment, everything seemed to stand still, silent, breathless, waiting. And then the serpent was gone. All that remained was the storm, the silence that followed, and the air thick with the remnants of something far greater than what had just occurred. The winds that had whipped so violently were now calm, the clouds parted like curtains revealing a new sky. The storm, in all its fury, had passed. But the Thunderbird didn't stop. It was still there, hovering, its massive form silhouetted against the now clear sky. It let out a triumphant cry, a sound so powerful it seemed to echo across time and space. The battle had been won, but it wasn't just a victory over the serpent. It was a victory for the balance, for nature, for everything the Thunderbird had protected since time began. Sarah stood still, her breath shallow, her heart racing. The thunder had stopped, but the air still crackled with the power of what had just happened. It wasn't just the defeat of the serpent that she felt, it was something much deeper, something that resonated in the very core of her being. The storm was over. But what came after, the peace, the calm, the sense of something having shifted forever, was overwhelming. The world was different now. It would never be the same. But as Sarah gazed up at the Thunderbird, standing triumphant in the now peaceful sky, she understood. The battle had been hard, and the cost had been high, but it had been worth it. For the balance had been restored, for the world was saved, and for the Thunderbird, whose fury had been unleashed, whose power had been tested, it had done what it was born to do. It had protected the world, and now it stood, not as a beast, but as a force of nature, unchallenged and triumphant. And Sarah knew, in her heart, that the world was in safe hands. The storm was over, but the world was far from still. The sky had cleared, its once dark clouds now only a distant memory. The sun began to peek through the horizon, casting golden rays over the landscape. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the air seemed to breathe, gentle and cool, as though it was waking up after a long, restless sleep. Trees, once bent under the weight of the storm, began to straighten, their leaves catching the light, sparkling with droplets of water. The earth seemed to sigh, as if it, too, was relieved. But there was no celebration, no joy in the stillness. Only a quiet, somber understanding hung in the air. Sarah stood on the edge of the clearing, her eyes fixed on the horizon, watching as the world slowly began to recover. The winds were calm now, a soft breeze brushing against her face, cooling the sweat that still clung to her skin. She could hear the sounds of life returning, birds singing in the trees, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of animals as they ventured out from the shelter they had sought during the tempest. The land was healing. But even in this peace, there was a weight. The Thunderbird, once fierce and untamed, now stood perched on the edge of the forest, its wings tucked close to its sides, its form still and watchful. It was not a creature that celebrated. It was a guardian, a protector of balance, and its duty had come at a great cost. The battle with the serpent had been fierce, and the price had been steep. Lives had been lost, sacrifices made, and the land itself had been scarred by the storm's rage. But now, in the aftermath, Sarah could feel the quiet understanding settle in her chest. The peace was fragile. She couldn't shake the feeling that, for all the triumph, something was missing. The balance had been restored, but at what cost? The price had been paid. The world was no longer under the serpent's shadow, but what would prevent it from returning? What would protect this fragile peace? As she looked at the Thunderbird, she felt the weight of its ancient wisdom, the knowing gaze of a creature that had seen the rise and fall of empires, the cycles of nature repeated over and over again. It had fought not just for survival, but for balance. The storm had come, the battle had been fought, and now the world would heal. But it would never be the same. She would never be the same. Sarah's mind drifted back to the moment when she had felt the pulse of the Thunderbird within her, the storm that had coursed through her veins. She had felt the power, the overwhelming force that had pushed her to the edge of her limits. It had been a test, a call to action. And she had answered. But now, as the land healed and the thunder faded away, she felt the quiet echo of the storm in her soul. Balance was not something that could be won and then forgotten. It was not something that could be kept for long without constant effort, constant vigilance. The land, the world, it could slip back into chaos if left unattended, if left unchecked. The fight was not over. It would never be over. The storm might have passed, but it was only a matter of time before another threat would rise, another force of darkness, another imbalance that needed to be restored. The cost of balance was not a one-time payment. It was a price that had to be paid over and over again, each and every day. The realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. She had thought that the battle was the end, that defeating the serpent would bring the peace they so desperately sought. But it was not that simple. The Thunderbird had known this all along. Its role, its existence, was not one of triumph or rest. It was a constant, eternal presence, a reminder that the world needed protection, that balance needed to be maintained. And so did she. Sarah felt a deep, aching truth settle in her heart. The world would always need protectors. The Thunderbird, with its fierce power and wisdom, could not do it alone. It was not enough to simply defeat the serpent, to restore order. The world was always shifting, always in flux. And if she had learned anything in this moment, it was that balance was not something that could ever be fully achieved, it was something that must be constantly fought for. She thought of Yarrick, of the sacrifices made along the way. She thought of the lives lost, the pain that had been endured. Was it worth it? Yes, she knew it was. The world had been saved, the storm had passed, and the land would heal. But she knew, deep down, that the work was never truly finished. There would always be more to fight for, more to protect, more to sacrifice. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the light spreading across the land, Sarah took a deep breath. The storm was over, but the work was just beginning. The land would heal, but the vigilance, the constant awareness of the balance that must be kept, would remain. She could no longer afford to be naive, to think that peace would simply fall into place. It had to be guarded, fiercely and without hesitation. The Thunderbird spread its wings, its powerful eyes fixed on the horizon. It had done its part, but its watch was never over. And now, Sarah knew her watch had just begun. There would be no rest. There could be no rest. The storm had passed, but the thunder would always echo in the distance. The air was still, the kind of stillness that comes after a storm has passed, quiet but filled with the weight of what had been lost and what had been gained. Sarah stood at the edge of the forest, looking out over the land that had been forever changed. The trees, once bowed and broken by the tempest, now stood tall again, their branches stretching toward the sky, reaching for the light as though they, too, were eager to shake off the memories of the battle. The earth beneath her feet felt different, as though the ground itself had been reborn, each blade of grass a testament to the struggle, the sacrifice, and the triumph that had taken place. But there was something else now, a presence, faint but undeniable. She had come here, drawn by a pull she couldn't explain, her heart thumping in her chest, a restless feeling gnawing at her. It had been hours since the storm had passed, hours since the final battle had been fought. The Thunderbird had taken its place in the sky again, a shadow against the setting sun, ever watchful, ever guarding. But even from a distance, Sarah knew it was still there, its watch not over, its bond with her unbroken. And yet, something told her that the Thunderbird was not just watching from afar. No, it had left her a sign, a reminder. She didn't know why she felt it, but she knew. As she walked slowly through the grass, her steps soft, she noticed something glinting on the ground ahead. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, a reflection of the sun off a nearby rock or twig. But as she drew closer, she saw it clearly, a single feather. It was large, its edges tinged with gold, its center dark and strong, like the wings of a bird who had seen countless skies, who had weathered storms and soared through the heavens. It was unmistakable. Her breath caught in her throat. She knelt down, her fingers trembling as she reached for the feather. She held it in her hands, the delicate strands brushing against her skin, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The feather was beautiful, but it was also broken. One side was frayed, as though it had been torn during a battle. And yet, despite its brokenness, it felt whole. There was power in it, a force that coursed through her hands as she cradled it carefully. The weight of its history, of everything it represented, pressed against her chest, and she could feel the bond, the unspoken connection that had been forged in the heat of the storm, in the fury of the battle. It was a bond that no one could see, no one could understand. But it was there, as real as the ground beneath her, as real as the beating of her heart. She could feel it, a pulse that matched her own, a rhythm that echoed in her veins. The Thunderbird had left this feather for her, a mark of its enduring presence, its watchfulness. It wasn't just a symbol of the power it had shared with her, or the strength it had given her in the darkest moments. It was a promise. A promise that it would always be with her, even when she couldn't see it, even when she couldn't feel its wings in the sky above. The winds began to stir around her, a gentle breeze that whispered through the trees, rustling the leaves as though the world itself was trying to speak to her. She closed her eyes, listening to the soft murmur of the earth, and in that moment, she could hear the Thunderbird's call. It wasn't a sound, not a noise that could be heard with ears. It was a feeling, deep inside her, a presence that filled the air with the weight of its words. It was watching. She stood there, holding the feather tightly, her heart heavy with the weight of the knowledge that the battle had only been the beginning. The peace that had followed was fragile, and the world would need protectors, now more than ever. But the Thunderbird was still there, its power still rippling through the very fabric of the land. And she, too, had become a part of that. She had been chosen, had fought alongside the great creature, had felt its power surge through her. It wasn't something that could be erased, something that could be forgotten. The connection between them was too strong, too undeniable. She gazed up toward the sky, her eyes searching for any sign of the Thunderbird, but it was too high, too far away. She could see nothing, but she felt its presence all the same. The feather in her hand was not just a reminder of what had happened, of the storm they had weathered together. It was a promise of what was to come. There would always be more to fight for, more battles to face. But as long as this feather remained, broken as it was proof that the Thunderbird's watch would never end. And with it, she was not alone. She didn't know how long she stood there, the sky shifting from golden hues to the cool blues of evening. The world around her settled into a quiet rhythm, the chirp of insects and the rustle of leaves a soft lullaby that calmed her restless heart. But the weight of the feather in her hand reminded her that no matter how peaceful the land seemed, no matter how calm the skies became, the work was never finished. The storm might have passed, but the Thunderbird's watch continued. And she, too, had a role to play. As the last rays of sunlight faded into dusk, Sarah turned and walked back toward the others. She held the feather carefully, as though it was something fragile, something sacred. She knew it wasn't just a token. It was a part of her now, a part of everything they had fought for. And no matter where she went, no matter how far she traveled, it would always be with her, a sign that the bond they had forged was unbreakable. The feather was broken, but it was still whole. The winds had shifted again, a cold breeze creeping through the trees, brushing against the skin like the faintest hint of a forgotten memory. It was just enough to make the hairs on the back of Sarah's neck stand on end. She wasn't alone in this moment. It was as if something, or someone, was watching from the shadows. The land had healed, or so it seemed. The scars of the battle were still there, faint traces on the earth, but nothing compared to the tempest that had once raged. The sky, once cracked open with lightning, had settled into the soft calm of the evening. Yet, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The peace felt fragile, as if it could slip away with the smallest disturbance. Her hand gripped the broken feather tightly, the connection to the Thunderbird still strong. The air around her buzzed with energy, the remnants of the storm still lingering in the atmosphere. The great bird had done its part. The land was quiet now. But the silence, the stillness, seemed to stretch on for too long. It was a feeling she couldn't explain, a quiet voice at the edge of her mind. She had faced darkness before, the full force of the storm, the serpent, the chaos of the battle, but this was different. This was subtle. A shadow moving just out of sight, a whisper that couldn't quite be caught. It gnawed at her, something unfamiliar yet achingly familiar, like a scent on the wind she couldn't place. She had been walking for hours, lost in thought, but now she stopped. The sudden shift in the air stopped her in her tracks. The trees were still, unnervingly still, the birds silenced as if the world itself was holding its breath. Her heart hammered in her chest, a slow, rising fear that pressed against her ribs, forcing her to step back, to listen harder. It came again, the faintest whisper. The wind, or maybe it was the trees themselves, seemed to murmur words she couldn't understand. But she felt them. They were there, curling around her thoughts like a serpent winding through her mind, leaving a trail of unease. It was a voice, a presence. Not the Thunderbirds, no, this was something darker. Something far more insidious. Her eyes darted around, but the woods were still. The world was calm, nothing to give her a hint of the danger that crept beneath the surface. She gripped the feather tighter, feeling its warmth against her palm, yet even this connection didn't seem enough to silence the whispers that tugged at the edges of her mind. The Thunderbird had told her its task was not finished. But this felt like something else. She took a few cautious steps forward, her breath catching in her throat as the whispers seemed to grow louder, though no words were spoken. The shadows beneath the trees deepened, stretching longer, darker. For a moment, she could almost hear the rustle of something moving through the underbrush, just out of sight. Her heart pounded, but she couldn't move. It was as if the very air around her had thickened, pressed down upon her chest. There was a weight to it now, something pressing against her, pushing, trying to force her to understand, to see what was hidden just out of reach. And then, for just a brief, chilling moment, she felt it. A flicker of darkness, a coldness, sharp and sudden, like a shadow falling across her soul. It was a fleeting feeling, but it was enough to send a shiver through her entire being. She wasn't imagining it. The fight wasn't over. The forces she had hoped to banish, the darkness she had faced down, those things were still here, still waiting. Waiting for the right moment, for the smallest crack in the peace they had fought so hard to reclaim. The wind shifted again, and with it, the whispering stopped. The trees creaked softly as if they, too, were listening. Sarah's breath was the only sound now, sharp and quick. She stepped forward cautiously, but the feeling didn't leave. It lingered, clinging to her like a fog. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but the truth was harder to face. This wasn't just an echo of the past, of the serpent they had fought. This was something new, something more dangerous, and it was still out there. The shadows seemed to dance around her as she continued to move, as though they were alive, watching, waiting. She had never known fear like this, not the battle cries, not the roaring of the wind in her ears, not the crash of lightning. This was quieter, more insidious. A shadow creeping over the light. The feather in her hand felt like a connection to something far greater than herself, a bond that had once been strong, once given her strength. But now, as she held it, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that it wasn't enough. The Thunderbird had done its part, but now the land itself seemed to speak of more danger, more darkness hidden beneath the surface. Her fingers tightened around the feather. The Thunderbird had not left. It was always watching, always waiting. But Sarah knew now that their fight had not ended with the fall of the serpent. The balance, fragile as it was, still teetered on the edge. Something in the shadows was stirring, and it was only a matter of time before it would rise again. The wind whispered once more, faint and distant. The shadows under the trees seemed to shift. And Sarah knew, in her heart, that the battle was far from over. The darkness that had been pushed back was only gathering its strength, waiting for the moment to strike. She turned back, her resolve hardening. Whatever was to come, whatever storm would rage next, she would face it head-on. She would not let the shadows win. But even as she walked away, the whispering lingered, echoing in the corners of her mind. And she couldn't help but wonder, how long before the storm returned? There was something quiet about the evening, as if the world itself was listening. Sarah sat on a low rock near the edge of the woods, a gentle breeze brushing against her face, carrying with it the scent of pine and earth. The sky above was fading into twilight, the sun sinking slowly behind the horizon. The sounds of the forest had softened, each rustling leaf, each distant bird call, becoming part of a tapestry of peace. Yet, within her, there was no peace. The weight of the battles, of the lives lost, the sacrifices made, lingered in her heart like a storm that never quite passed. She had seen things, felt things, things that words could never truly capture. She had felt the power of the Thunderbird, the fierce crackle of lightning, the thunder that shook the very bones of the earth. She had witnessed the fragility of balance and the cost it demanded. And she knew now, without a doubt, that the land could not heal until the story was told. It was strange, how time seemed to fold in on itself. The world had moved on, the earth beginning to recover from the cataclysm, the people slowly rebuilding, but the Thunderbird's story needed to be shared. The legends would fade otherwise. And the Thunderbird, its strength, its sacrifice, its endless watch over the world, couldn't be forgotten. Sarah placed the feather from the Thunderbird into her hand, its edges soft yet strong. The bond they had shared in the chaos of the storm felt like a distant memory now, but it was one that would never leave her. She had been a part of something greater than herself, something powerful, something that transcended time and space. The sound of approaching footsteps stirred her from her thoughts. She glanced up to find a group of children, no older than 8 or 9, their faces lit with curiosity. They had heard of the storms, of the fierce battles, of the Thunderbird itself, but they had only heard the echoes of these stories, retold in hushed voices. Now, they had come to her, drawn by the same whispers that had tugged at her heart all this time. "Who fought with the Thunderbird?" she asked, her voice small but full of wonder. Sarah smiled softly, the corners of her mouth tugging up in a quiet acknowledgement. The past seemed so distant now, yet here it was, pressing against her, asking to be remembered. "Yes," she said simply, her voice quiet. "I was there, in the storm. And I can tell you its story." The children gathered around her, sitting on the grass in front of her, their eyes bright with anticipation. Sarah felt a flicker of warmth in her chest. These children didn't know the true weight of what had happened. They didn't know the sacrifices, the battles, the cost. But in their eyes, she could see the same spark that had driven her once, the desire to know, to understand, to carry the torch forward. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the earth, Sarah began to speak. She spoke softly at first, recounting the legend of the Thunderbird, of its mighty wings, its power to summon storms, and its watchful presence over the world. Her words flowed like a river, each one carrying the weight of memory and emotion. She described the lightning that cracked the sky, the thundering roars that shook the mountains, the moments when she had stood face to face with something beyond comprehension. She spoke of the serpent, of the darkness that had threatened to swallow the world, and of the sacrifices made to protect the balance. The children listened intently, their eyes wide as they imagined the fierce battles, the life-or-death struggles that had raged across the land. Every now and then, one of them would gasp in amazement, their hands clutching the grass beneath them as if they were trying to hold onto the very air Sarah breathed. But as the story continued, the words grew softer, more reflective. She spoke of the Thunderbird's gift, its watchfulness, its ever-present gaze that would never fade, even in the darkest of times. The sacrifice, she explained, was not just in the battles fought but in the quiet moments in between. The Thunderbird's role was never finished, and its power would always be needed. That was the way of balance, the way of nature. The children didn't fully understand all of it, how could they? But they understood the essence of it. The Thunderbird was a protector, a guardian of the world, and Sarah had been chosen to stand beside it in its final, greatest fight. That bond, that connection, could not be erased. As the last light of day disappeared from the sky, Sarah's voice grew even quieter. The Thunderbird's watch will never end. Its story, its legend, must live on. We must tell it, so that the generations to come will know. So that they, too, will understand the balance between light and darkness. The sacrifices that must be made. And the courage it takes to stand against the storm. The children sat in silence, their eyes wide with wonder, their hearts stirred by the tale. One by one, they stood, a sense of reverence in their expressions. They didn't need to say anything. Their hearts had already heard what they needed to hear. As the last of the children walked away, their minds filled with the power of the Thunderbird story, Sarah sat in the quiet dusk, feeling a bittersweet ache in her chest. The world would change, and new challenges would come, but the story of the Thunderbird, the legend of its strength, its sacrifice, and its eternal watch, would be passed on. It would live, breathe, and grow, carried in the hearts of those who believed. Sarah stood, brushing the dirt from her pants, and walked back toward the campfire, her heart light. The storm might have passed, but its echoes would remain. The Thunderbird's legacy would endure, not in the power of its wings, but in the stories told, and the hearts touched by its thunder. The winds picked up again, a soft rumble of thunder echoing in the distance. It was a whisper, just a whisper, but it felt like a promise. The storm was never truly gone. It had only changed, taking root in the stories, the memories, the people. And in that moment, Sarah knew the Thunderbird spirit would always be there, alive in every tale, and every heart that dared to remember. The sky stretched vast and endless, bathed in the quiet hues of dawn. The air was still, but the earth seemed to hum with a life of its own, as if the world was holding its breath. High above, the first rays of light pierced through the clouds, painting them in shades of pink and gold. It was a moment that felt suspended in time, where the weight of everything that had happened, all the battles fought, the lives lost, and the sacrifices made, was somehow both present and far away. And then, as if answering some silent call, the heavens trembled. A crack of thunder echoed across the sky, sharp and sudden, causing the earth beneath to shiver. The wind picked up, swirling in a spiral of anticipation. The world seemed to exhale, as if it had been holding its breath for too long. From the depths of the clouds, a silhouette appeared, mighty wings outstretched, cutting through the morning sky with a grace that defied the storm's fury. The Thunderbird. Sarah stood at the edge of the cliff, her feet firmly planted on the earth, but her heart was already rising. She could feel it, the same powerful energy that had once coursed through her veins. The Thunderbird was returning. It had always been there, watching over them, and now it was lifting away from the world, back to where it belonged. But it wasn't leaving, not truly. The Thunderbird's essence would remain, always. It was in the sky, in the earth, in the winds that whispered through the trees. The bird soared higher, its massive wings cutting through the air like living lightning. The thunder rumbled, growing louder, shaking the very heavens. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she watched, the beauty and the sorrow of the moment crashing into each other. There was a weight to the Thunderbird's flight now, a finality that tugged at her soul. Above, the Thunderbird climbed higher, climbing toward the clouds, toward the stars. Its great wings spread wide, and with each beat, it seemed to pull the storm into itself, swallowing the dark clouds and scattering them to the corners of the world. It was a battle, but this time it was different. This time, there was no enemy to face. The Thunderbird had done what it had set out to do. It had protected the balance, had fought the darkness, had given everything it could to ensure that the world would continue to turn. Now, it was returning to the heavens, leaving behind a world forever changed. One of the children, a girl with wide eyes and wild hair, stepped forward shyly. "Are you the one?" Sarah's eyes locked onto the Thunderbird as it disappeared into the clouds, its form a mere shadow against the rising sun. The sky began to clear, the storm passing, leaving only the traces of its fury. But it wasn't just the sky that had changed. It was everything. The earth, the people, the very air that breathed life into them. The world would never be the same, but it would be better. It would be more. In the stillness that followed, Sarah felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The struggle had been fierce, and the cost had been high. But the Thunderbird had given its all, and it had ensured that balance would remain. Now, it was time for the world to find its own way again, to rebuild, to heal. The battle was over. The storm had passed. Yet even as the Thunderbird vanished from sight, Sarah knew that its legacy would never fade. It was written into the stars, etched into the very fabric of the world. The sky above would forever bear witness to its power, its sacrifice, its endless watch. The story would live on, passed down through generations, told by the firelight of countless nights. The world would remember. The wind stilled, and for a moment, it felt like everything held its breath once again. The sun shone brighter now, casting golden light over the land, warming the earth beneath Sarah's feet. The birds began to sing once more, the distant rumble of the thunder fading into the background. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. She could hear the soft whisper of the wind, the rustling of the leaves, the distant calls of the forest. She could hear the Thunderbird still, in the silence, and the echo of its wings. She could feel it in her soul, a presence that would never truly leave. As the light grew stronger, the last traces of the storm vanished, leaving behind only the memory of what had been. The land was still, but not quiet. It hummed with life, with possibility, with hope. The air felt fresh, alive with potential, as if the earth itself was stretching out, ready for what came next. Sarah stood there, a lone figure against the horizon, watching the sky. She didn't know where the Thunderbird had gone, or what the future would bring, but she knew one thing for certain: it was no longer just a story. It was a part of the world now, a part of her. And as long as the stars shone in the sky, as long as the thunder rumbled and the wind whispered through the trees, the Thunderbird would always be there. Somewhere, in the depths of the sky, its wings would forever echo, and its story would live on. The world had changed, yes, but it had also been reborn. The Thunderbird had fulfilled its purpose. It had given everything it had to ensure that balance was maintained, that light would return to the dark places, that the world would have a chance to heal. Now, it was time to let go, to rise up and return to the heavens. And as Sarah watched the last trace of the Thunderbird disappear into the clouds, she felt a deep sense of peace. The storm had passed, and the world would never forget what it had witnessed. The Thunderbird had left its mark, on the world, on the people, and on her heart. It had etched its legend into the stars, and there, in the sky above, it would remain, a symbol of strength, sacrifice, and eternal watchfulness. Forever a part of the world, forever a part of the sky. And so, the endless sky stretched on, as it always had, and always would.